Paul Kane's Journey. Wednesday, September 9, 1846. When Paul Kane arrived at Fort Carlton with members of the Hudson's Bay Company Fur Brigade under the command of Chief Factor John Rowand, he described the landscape around the fort. Kane noted that they had left the area of unbroken forest and were now surrounded by
gently undulating plains being dotted here and there with clumps of small trees. The banks of the river rise to the height of 150 or 200 feet in smooth rolling hills covered with verdure. The fort, which is situated about a quarter of a mile back from the river, is enclosed with wooden pickets, and is fortified with blunderbusses on swivels mounted in the bastion.
Kane recorded that Fort Carlton was a trading post for the Cree Indians, one of the largest tribes in the jurisdiction of the Hudson's Bay Company. The Cree, who lived along the Saskatchewan River as far as the Rockies, were continually at war with the Blackfoot. For this reason, Kane worried about the adequacy of the fortifications and the number of its defenders. However, typical Cree Blackfoot warfare involved only relatively minor skirmishes, and
few scalps and horses taken from the enemy are quite sufficient to entitle the warriors to return to their friends in triumph and glory.
For most of the 19th century, Fort Carlton was at the crossroads of two major transportation routes of the West, the North Saskatchewan River, and the Carlton Trail, which was the overland route from Fort Garry, now Winnipeg, to Fort Edmonton. Burned to the ground during the North-West Rebellion, it was reconstructed in the 1960s, and in 1967, Canada's centennial, Fort Carlton Historic Park was opened. The Cree culture was at its peak area in 1760, but by 1846 their numbers had dwindled as a result of struggles with Blackfoot to the west and smallpox epidemics. Thursday, September 10, 1846. That evening they were alarmed by a rapidly approaching prairie fire from the west. Fortunately, only 1 kilometer from the post, a wind change turned the flames to the south. Because all the brigade boats had not arrived, the party had to remain at Fort Carlton for a few days. Kane made a sketch of Uskuskusish, young grass, a Cree brave who had been wounded many times. He was unhappy with Kane's picture when he found it did not show all the scars. The man told Kane about his younger brother who had been murdered by one of his own tribe during a quarrel. An older brother had chased the murderer for 6 months before killing him and getting his revenge. Kane noted the custom of taking one life for another life and that many deaths occurred until either powerful friends forced someone to stop or something valuable such as horses were offered and accepted by both parties. Thursday, September 12, 1846. With Mr. John Rowand, who was in charge of the Saskatchewan district of the Hudson's Bay Company at Fort Edmonton, and Reverend Robert Rundle, the first Protestant missionary in Alberta, Kane decided, rather than be confined to a boat, to proceed to Fort Pitt by horseback. Before starting on their journey and intrigued by the Cree method of killing the buffalo, the three men accompanied a group of hunters on their way to a buffalo pound about 10 kilometers away. Built near a forest, the pound was made by piling logs 1.5 meter high to enclose a 1-hectare area. Kane watched Cree anxiously awaiting the arrival of buffalo which their companions were driving towards the pound. Kane's graphic description of the hunt reveals his keen sense of visual drama. He related how a lead Cree on their quickest horse rode up to a herd of buffalo and, when he got reasonably close, struck a light with flint and steel with which he ignited some dried grass. The smoke forced a buffalo to stampede away from it. The Cree hunter then rode up alongside the herd,
which, from some unaccountable propensity, invariably endeavor to cross in front of his horse. The hunter thus possesses an unfailing means, wherever the pound may be situated, of conducting them to it by the dexterous management of his horse. Once the buffalo began to enter the pound, Cree inside dressed in buffalo robes stood up shaking the robes and yelling. Urging them on with their screams, they directed the buffalo to a place in the center of the pound where a tree stood, hung with offerings to the Great Spirit. A Cree was stationed in the tree with a medicine pipestem in his hand. This he waved, all the while chanting prayers to the Great Spirit that the buffalo be numerous and fat.
Once captured, the entrance of the pound was closed with logs. The Cree then killed the enclosed buffalo with spears and arrows. Strangely enough, the buffalo seldom attempted to flee, though the pound would have easily collapsed if they had. Kane found the buffalo drive into the compound exciting and picturesque, but did not like witnessing the slaughter. They had driven 3 herds into the pound within about 11 days and there was a strong smell from the rotting remains. That evening Kane's party selected a camping spot along the North Saskatchewan River and waited for the boats to reach them. Kane mentions the brigade left Fort Pitt on September 23, whereas Rundle's journals have them leaving the next day. Mount Rundle in Banff National Park is named after Reverend Robert Rundle, a Methodist missionary who visited the region in 1847. Sunday, September 13, 1846. In the morning Kane, Rowand, and Rundle passed a small island where they saw many deer. Kane hobbled his horse by tying the front feet together, so that the animal could not wander away while the artist went hunting for game. He trailed a wounded buck for some time but was unable to shoot him when he found the animal lying down, too exhausted to go on. On his return Kane found 2 wolves about to attack his terrified horse. This time he was able to act, killing both with his double-barreled gun one after another. Returning to the rest of the party, Kane found them hanging 2 deer they had shot for the boat cruise. They placed the carcasses where they would be seen from the river. The animals were hung from a triangle of poles 4 meters high so that wolves could not reach the meat, and a red handkerchief was fastened to the top to discourage crows. It was a beautiful evening and Kane stayed behind to sketch buffalo grazing along the banks of the North Saskatchewan River while the rest went on, promising to wait for him at the river crossing.
It was the commencement of Indian summer, the evening was very fine, and threw that peculiar soft, warm haziness over the landscape, which is supposed to proceed from the burning of the immense prairies. The sleepy buffaloes grazing upon the undulating hills, here and there relieved by clumps of small trees, the unbroken stillness, and the approaching evening, rendered it altogether a scene of most enchanting repose.
When crossing a river, provisions that had to be kept dry were put into a basket made of buffalo skin stretched over willow twigs in the shape of a bowl.
The basket was floated in the water, and dragged by a string held in the teeth. The horse was then driven in, and the traveler, holding on the horse's tail, was safely pulled to the other side with his baggage.
The brigade boats of the Hudson's Bay Company were proceeding up the North Saskatchewan River from Fort Carlton. They were traveling in a southwesterly direction until they reached about 30 kilometers northwest of Saskatoon, when they turned northwest, passing today's North Battleford. Monday, September 14, 1846. The party saw a large number of antelope which Kane described as
amazingly fleet, and very shy, but, strange to say, possessed of great curiosity, apparently determined to look at everything they do not understand, so long as they do not scent it.
While Kane made a sketch of the valley, their guide set off to demonstrate how to hunt antelope. Making sure the wind was blowing from the animals towards him, the hunter worked his way closer and hid behind a small bush. He then gently waved a piece of rag tied to his ramrod, and as the curious antelope came over to investigate, a shot was fired. The hunter had only one chance, for the fleet-footed antelope were gone in an instant. That evening the party saw distant smoke and, speculating that it came from an Indian encampment, they waited for the boats to arrive before camping so that there would be reinforcements if the Indians were hostile. Tuesday, September 15, 1846. Kane's party crossed the river and visited the Indian camp. Mr. Rowand was acquainted with the chiefs, and the only difficulty was getting away when the Crees wished to spend more time in friendly talk. Kane's group left, but the Indians
detained a boat that had not yet come up, and the persons in charge had to give them some tobacco before they were allowed to proceed.
Wednesday, September 16, 1846. The morning was spent riding across the prairie parkland which Kane described as
a most delightful country, covered with luxuriant herbage, the plains being enameled with flowers of various kinds, presenting more the aspect of a garden than of uncultivated land.
While roasting meat over a fire for their breakfast and grazing their horses, they spotted some Indians across the river signaling to another party behind them and whom they could not see. A group of 8 young men soon arrived and, finding them friends, Kane's party was invited into their camp where they bartered for horses. Kane sketched the back of one of the chiefs, Otiskin, or the Horn, to show his war cap and the bag which he carried behind.
These bags are constantly worn, and contain some of the bones or hair of their deceased relatives. These relics they regard with the greatest of veneration, and make them their constant companions, whether riding, walking, or sleeping. They are generally worn for a period of 3 years.
Before the end of the day, Kane had to spend time finding his horse, because some hungry Indian dogs ate the leather lasso with which it was tied. Thursday, September 17, 1846. Their guide woke the camp in the night to announce that the horses had been stolen, but he would not go after them alone. Everyone got up, and after running a couple of kilometers, they came up with the horses pursued by a band of wolves,
the billets of wood attached to their lassos having retarded their further escape, the wolves were loath to leave their expected prey, but after a shot or two they took to flight.
The terrified horses remained very close to the campfire the rest of the night. During the day they killed an antelope. This was fortunate because that evening Mr. and Mrs. Richard Lane arrived in an exhausted state after traveling the whole day on foot without food. Mr. Lane, who was in charge of part of the brigade, had left the boat that morning in order to walk for a change. However, later in the day, the boats were on the far side of the river and there was no channel through that would allow the Lanes to be picked up. Unfortunately, it was a cold night, there was little wood for a fire and Kane's party had neither tents nor blankets. A young clerk who had accompanied the Lanes was in an especially bad way as he had neither coat nor vest. Earlier in his journal, Kane mentioned that Richard Lane, a Hudson's Bay Company clerk, was traveling west with his new bride. Lane was in charge of the brigade boat which carried furs from the Hudson's Bay Company to the Russian government as its annual payment for the privilege of trading in Russian territory. There were 70 packs, each containing 75 of the highest quality skins. The skins had been collected along the Mackenzie River, Northwest Territories, and carried to York Factory on Hudson Bay where the best were selected and repacked with the greatest care. Each year the skins were sent inland with the Fall Brigade to Lake Winnipeg, up the Saskatchewan River, across the Rocky Mountains, down the Columbia River to Vancouver Island and then up the west coast to the community of Sitka. The state of Alaska was once Russian territory. Saturday, September 19, 1846. The boats found a channel in the morning and picked up the Lanes. Some hours later Kane's party arrived at Fort Pitt.
It is a neat and compact little fort, and is, like all the rest of the forts except those at Red River, constructed of wood. The country here abounds in buffalo, grain and other produce might be raised plentifully here if cultivated.
Since it left Fort Carlton 7 days before, the brigade had traveled 350 kilometers up the North Saskatchewan River to reach Fort Pitt. Established in 1829 as a Hudson's Bay Company post, Fort Pitt played a major role in the fur trade and settlement of the early West. For over half a century it was a major provisioning post between Forts Carlton and Edmonton. The original fort is a picnic site today, although archaeologists can tell where the buildings once stood and where Indians camped, none of the original buildings remain. No rebuilding has been done with the exception of a vacant log structure which was built by a local resident in 1949 to represent a building in the middle of what used to be the post square. A cairn has been erected on the site of the cemetery. Sunday, September 20th to Tuesday, September 22nd, 1846. Kane spent 3 days at the fort and while there sketched the only Chippewayan Indian he saw on his trip, Kamaza, or Little Slave, who had the reputation of being a fine hunter. He had brought about 100 moose skins to trade. Wednesday, September 23, 1846. Kane left Fort Pitt with Roland, Rundle, an Indian boy and a new hunter.
We left this establishment in true voyageur style, unburthened with food of any kind, and, although contemplating a journey of 200 miles, trusting solely to our guns, having not even a grain of salt.
They crossed the North Saskatchewan by boat with the horses, led by the bridle, swimming behind. After reaching the other side, they had gone about 16 kilometers on horseback when they found themselves among a large herd of buffalo. Mr. Rowan fired and wounded a cow which ran into the bush. When he followed, the animal turned on him and knocked both man and horse to the ground. It then jumped over the two and ran off with the rest of the herd. Fortunately, nothing was hurt but Rowan's pride. Kane left the North Saskatchewan and traveled overland to Edmonton, but he reports little about the route. Reverend Robert Rundle's mention of a number of landmarks imply that the group was probably traveling over the same route followed and documented 12 years later by Dr. James Hector of the Palliser expedition in March 1858. Hector called it the Odometer Trail. Thursday, September 24, 1846. The party passed through Long Grass Prairie. Here they found a camp of Indians who had died of smallpox. Bleached bones were everywhere, having fallen from many burial platforms that had been built in the trees. They spotted a grizzly bear drinking from a pond and the group's hunter went ahead to try and get a shot. The bear was waiting for the attack and the hunter, fearing his horse was not fast enough, fired from too far away and missed his mark. The bear stood on its hind legs and walked away. Kane decided to attack and wounded the animal in the shoulder. When the bear gave full chase, Kane galloped towards Rowan, who made another hit. but the bear continued chasing them. The Indian and Kane had now reloaded, and the Indian fired as the bear advanced. Hit once more, the animal rose again on its hind legs, giving Kane a chance to fire a ball into its heart to kill the animal.
The Indian now skinned him and cut off his paws, which we found most delicious picking when roasted in the evening. There is no animal on the whole continent that the Indians hold in so much dread as the grizzly bear, and few will attack one of them when alone, unless with a very fleet horse under him.
While racing through an area where there were great quantities of shed deer antlers, Mr. Rowan's horse was badly hurt and had to be left to the wolves. Fortunately, extra horses had been brought for such emergencies. They had been passing many dried-up lakes, but that evening camped along the edge of a very beautiful freshwater lake. Because buffalo were everywhere, it was almost impossible to find a place to camp. And they found it necessary to fire guns during the night to keep the animals away. Marwayne is the general area of Kane's long grass prairie. Friday, September 25, 1846. Passing Vermilion Lakes. Kane makes no reference to September 25th, although the Reverend Rundle mentions that on September 24th they camped by a lake and on the 25th they camped near Buffalo Hill. This is possibly Harry Hill, after which today's community is named. It was so called because buffalo shed their coats on the hill each spring. Saturday, September 26, 1846, or Sunday, September 27, 1846. Kane related that Rundle, because he was so tired from the previous day's travel, remained in camp with the Indian boy. Rowan and Kane left at 3:30 a.m. After galloping almost all day, they met a party of gentlemen hunters from Fort Edmonton at about 5 p.m. An offer to exchange horses allowed the two men to continue the last 15 kilometers at the same fast pace. On reaching the river's edge opposite Fort Edmonton, Mr. Rowan plunged in and swam across on a fine large horse. Kane's horse was smaller,
and not being equal to the task, sank under me. Still, however, I held firmly onto him, till, drifting into the rapid, he struck a sunken rock in striving to obtain a footing, on which he nearly brought me under him, but, on drifting a little further down, he fortunately found footing in a more shallow part and was able to ford across, Mr. Rowan appearing greatly to enjoy the scene from his safe position on the shore. We were greeted by the occupants of the fort in their gayest attire, the day being Sunday.
Within hours of their arrival at Fort Edmonton, the sky was lit up by a wind-driven prairie fire that spread across the route the two men had just traveled.
The scene was terrific in the extreme. The night being intensely dark gave increased effect to the brilliancy of the flames.
At one point there was fear the fire would cross the river to the fort side. The two men were also worrying about Reverend Rundle, who had been left behind. Kane's statement as to why and when Rundle stayed behind conflicts with Rundle's own journal. The latter's journal reveals that he never traveled on Sundays and that on Saturday, September 26, he had breakfast at Egg Lake, today known as Whitford Lake, southeast of Andrew. That evening Rundle states he camped at Bear Hill River, which is probably today's Beaver Hill Creek. Monday, September 28 to Monday, October 5, 1846. Rev. Rundle and the Indian boy finally arrived safely. Having noted the fire a long way off, they had immediately headed for the nearest bend in the river and, just in time, had been able to cross over to the other side. Because they had to wait in Edmonton for the boat with Mr. Lane and the Russian packs, Kane took time to sketch and describe the fort.
Edmonton is a large establishment, as it has to furnish many other districts with provisions. A large supply is always kept on hand, consisting entirely of dried meat, tongues, and pemmican. There are usually here a chief factor and a clerk, with 40 or 50 men with their wives and children, amounting altogether to about 130, who all live within the pickets of the fort. Their employment consists chiefly in building boats for the trade, sawing timber, most of which they raft down the river from 90 miles higher up, cutting up the small poplar which abounds on the margin of the river for firewood, 800 cords of which are consumed every winter, to supply the numerous fires in the establishment. The employment of the women, who are all, without a single exception, either squaws or half-breeds, consists in making moccasins and clothing for the men, and converting the dried meat into pemmican. Edmonton is a large establishment, as it has to furnish many other districts with provisions. A large supply is always kept on hand, consisting entirely of dried meat, tongues, and pemmican. There are usually here a chief factor and a clerk, with 40 or 50 men with their wives and children, amounting altogether to about 130, who all live within the pickets of the fort. Their employment consists chiefly in building boats for the trade, sawing timber, most of which they raft down the river from 90 miles higher up, cutting up the small poplar which abounds on the margin of the river for firewood, 800 cords of which are consumed every winter, to supply the numerous fires in the establishment. The employment of the women, who are all, without a single exception, either native or Métis, consists in making moccasins and clothing for the men, and converting the dried meat into pemmican.
Kane also visited with the Indians, mostly Cree, who had come to trade. A sketch was made of an Assiniboine chief, Potokapoo Tiz, Little Round Man, who told stories of his war and hunting adventures. Kane was particularly shocked when he heard the story of how the man had killed his own mother. While traveling, the woman had told her son that she was too old and feeble to go on and asked him to put her out of her misery. Without any hesitation, he shot her on the spot.
I asked him whereabouts he had directed the ball. His reply was, "Do you think I would shoot her in a bad place? I hit her there," pointing his finger to the region of the heart. She died instantly, and I cried at first, but after I had buried her, the impression wore off.
One day while wandering south of the fort, Kane saw two Assiniboine Indians hunting buffalo. One was armed with a spear and the other a bow. He was impressed with the power of the bow and noted that sometimes the arrow passed through the animal and stuck in the ground beyond. Tuesday, October 6, 1846. On this day, Kane left Fort Edmonton for the west side of the mountains. Accompanying him were Mr. Lane, who was in charge of the Russian furs, Charles, a young clerk who was going to a post on the west side of the mountains, someone named McGillivray, Lane's new bride, and 16 men Kane does not name. They had 65 horses to carry provisions and baggage, for Edmonton was the last place they would be able to get supplies. There were problems trying to drag the men away from the comfortable quarters of the fort, and the horses were as frisky as usual on the first day of a trip. The party only succeeded in traveling 26 kilometers. Camping at Sturgeon Creek, Kane realized that soon they would no longer see buffalo, and he sketched a group of them lying beside a small lake. Kane was following the old Portage Trail from Fort Edmonton to Fort Assiniboine. Early explorers and fur traders looking for a water route across the continent found the North Saskatchewan suitable for navigation as far as Fort Edmonton, but the Athabasca River some 130 kilometers north was the entrance to the pass over the Rocky Mountains. Governor Simpson of the Hudson's Bay Company wrote,
September 21, 1824. With Cardinal the Freeman I made an agreement that he should in the course of the ensuing winter and spring get a horse track or ode cut from Fort Assiniboine to Edmonton House.
This was the first road in Alberta, and it continued to be used until long after the fur trade era. In the years 1897 to 98, during the Klondike Gold Rush, many gold seekers used the trail, as did early homesteaders in later years. The St. Albert Mission was started at this point on the Portage in 1861 by Father Lacombe. The community was established for Métis living in the Fort Edmonton area and was the first organized attempt to introduce agriculture to settlers in the district. Heading west from Fort Edmonton, Kane sketched a group of buffalo at Sturgeon Creek. Wednesday, October 7, 1846. Kane noticed that the prairies were quickly giving way to muskeg. The trail was becoming wet and swampy and almost impossible to travel. The horses were continually getting stuck, and as they tried to pull themselves out of the muck, their loads would often be thrown off into the mire. The travelers were able to vary their diet by killing great numbers of geese, although they did not have the salt that was needed to make them more palatable. The old portage from Fort Edmonton to Fort Assiniboine threaded its way through bush and timber, following the high land as much as possible, skirting around swamps and muskeg. Thursday, October 8, 1846. The woods had become thicker and an earlier windstorm had left trees, torn up by the roots, blocking the path. Progress was very slow and the men were constantly tired from having to cut a new path for the horses through the fallen timber. Friday, October 9, 1846. The trail was still poor and they had to keep the same slow pace as the loaded horses. There was no game to hunt to occupy their time and traveling was monotonous. They met Colin Fraser, who was in charge of Jasper House further west, and they traveled together. Fraser was one of the better-known figures of the fur trade. He had been brought west by Sir George Simpson as his personal piper. Carrying his pipes and dressed in his Scottish Highland costume, Fraser traveled with Simpson by canoe, and each time they stopped, at even the remotest outpost, the governor was piped ashore. Kane noted that the Indians often believed that Fraser must be related to
the Great Spirit, having, of course, never beheld so extraordinary a looking man, or such a musical instrument, which astonished them as much as the sound produced. One of the Indians asked him to intercede with the Great Spirit for him, but Fraser remarked, the petitioner little thought how limited his influence was in that quarter.
The trail crossed the Pembina River near Belvedere and ran parallel to Highway 33, it is known today as the Grizzly Trail, to Fort Assiniboine. Saturday, October 10, 1846. About 2 p.m. Kane arrived at Fort Assiniboine on the Athabasca River.
This establishment, although honored with the name of a fort, is a mere post used for taking care of horses, a common man or horsekeeper being in charge of it.
The location of Fort Assiniboine is mentioned in early records and historical writings from the late 1700s. The Indians were largely Assiniboine and Cree, although there were a few Métis and Freemen, the latter named because they were no longer employed by the fur companies. There were also Iroquois and some Mohawk who had been brought from the east by the fur companies. When the location was first used as a supply and transportation point, it was known as Athabasca River House. It was later named Fort Assiniboine in 1824 by the Hudson's Bay Company, after the Indians in the area. The old Portage Trail from Fort Edmonton to the Athabasca River was cut out during the winter of 1824-25. From then until 1885, when the Canadian Pacific Railway was pushed through to the coast via Calgary, the only practical route across Canada was up the Saskatchewan River from Lake Winnipeg to Edmonton, across this trail to Fort Assiniboine, up the Athabasca River to Jasper, and over the summit of the mountains to the Columbia River, which gave access to the coast. Sunday, October 11, 1846. 2 boats were found, and for the next 3 days the men set to work to repair them for the trip up the Athabasca River. Wednesday, October 14, 1846. At 2 p.m. on October 14, they set off on a 5-day trip up the Athabasca River against a strong current. Low water conditions made traveling even more difficult, for they had to pull their boats across gravel bars.
We saw no game nor Indians to break the monotony of our labor, and the nights and mornings were becoming very cold.
Thursday, October 15, 1846. It was cold and snowing when they stopped to have breakfast. A meeting was held, and because bad weather had set in, the decision was made that 5 men and 1 boat with the clerk Charles should return to Fort Edmonton with the Russian packs of otter skins, for they would never be able to haul them over the pass before winter. There were now 12 men remaining, huddled into 1 boat. Frequently, they had to get out and lighten the load because the river was very low. Almost continually, the men, waist deep in the water, struggled to drag the boat upstream with a line. One of the Iroquois voyageurs slipped off a log and almost drowned. 5 minutes after being pulled from the water, his clothes were stiff with ice. Kane was impressed with the hardiness of the men, and when he asked the Indian if he was cold, the reply was, "My clothes are cold, but I am not." The Iroquois Indians are more closely associated with eastern Canada, many having fled there from the United States following the American Revolution. Around the early 1800s they started coming west as voyageurs with the fur companies. The community of Calahoo, west of Edmonton, and close to the Fort Assiniboine-Fort Edmonton Trail, is named after a Métis of Iroquois origin. Friday, October 16, 1846. The arrival of cold weather now caused the group to wonder if it would ever be able to cross the mountains before spring. The line the men were using to pull the boat broke twice in the rapids, and the boat was nearly dashed to pieces on the rocks.
Had this misfortune happened, we should have lost all our provisions, and had a great chance of perishing with hunger.
Saturday, October 17 and Sunday, October 18, 1846. The weather was fine, but Kane was still not enjoying the trip on the Athabasca River.
This is the most monotonous river that ever I have met with in my travels. Nothing but point after point appearing, all thickly covered with pine, any extensive view being entirely out of the question. The course of the river, although tortuous, is rapid, but unbroken by falls, running at the rate of 6 or 7 miles an hour on the average.
Sir George Simpson's 1824 impression of the same river was entirely different.
The Athabasca River is one of the finest streams I have ever seen in the country, the current strong and steady with few rapids except at the upper parts, and navigable by boats of the largest size. The country seems rich in large and small animals as we saw numerous tracks daily, the banks finely wooded, and as we approached the mountain high and prominent and the face in many places exhibiting strata of iron. And the Athabasca River is one of the finest streams I have ever seen in the country, the current strong and steady with few rapids except at the upper parts, and navigable by boats of the largest size. The country seems rich in large and small animals as we saw numerous tracks daily, the banks finely wooded, and as we approached the mountain high and prominent and the face in many places exhibiting strata of iron and coal, the soil rich which with the climate in the lower parts would be favorable to cultivation.
Monday, October 19, 1846. Kane's party met an Indian hunter and his family.
We traded with them for some beaver meat and moose noses. The latter is the most delicate eating I ever met with, and is valued amongst the Indians beyond all other food.
The Indian hunter had 2 canoes and sold one to Colin Fraser, who took 4 men to lighten the load. They left ahead of the main party. Tuesday, October 20th and Wednesday, October 21st, 1846. The weather was fine and the party made good progress. Thursday, October 22nd, 1846. Kane reported that the men were in excellent spirits and singing. Stopping for breakfast, they had moose meat and beaver tails. Kane was intrigued by a tree they found lying on the ground. It had been cut down by beaver and measured 7 feet in circumference. 3 bears, an old one and 2 cubs, were found in a cache left by Colin Fraser. Later Kane would learn that the 2 cubs had been killed with 1 shot,
while one was climbing over the back of the other to ascend a bank. The cubs provided fine eating.
Friday, October 23, 1846. They came across Fraser's campfire still burning from the night before. Saturday, October 24, 1846. The party passed Rapids de Mort. The men got out but still had trouble getting the boat up the rapids. Although there was as yet no ice on the rapidly moving river, the ponds nearby were frozen hard enough to bear a man's weight. Some Saskatoon berry pemmican was stolen and part of it discovered in a bag of one of the men. He had found it more palatable than the standard ration.
Gilvray, being one of the most powerful men of the party, was called upon to administer punishment, which he did by repeatedly knocking the delinquent down.
Kane pointed out that the severity of the punishment was justified by the fact that
disastrous consequences can result in wilderness travel if food is not wisely managed.
Sunday, October 25 to Tuesday, October 27, 1846. Kane noted that
there was no change in the general aspect of the country, the same monotonous scenery still surrounded us.
Wednesday, October 28, 1846. Kane passed the mouth of the Oldman River, same name but different river than the one in the south, and recorded the following story.
The Indians say that an evil spirit once came down this river, which is so rapid that no canoe can ascend it, and that having reached its mouth, where it enters the Athabasca, he made 5 steps down, leaving a rapid at every step. These rapids are a mile apart. After which he returned and went up his own river and has not since been heard of.
These same rapids, just downstream from where the Oldman Creek enters the Athabasca, were called Dead Man's Rapid by James Hector of the Palliser expedition when he reached the spot on January 29, 1859. He recorded,
"Today we passed Dead Man's Rapid, which is a very dangerous place for the boats to pass when ascending to Jasper House. A few miles above this we passed Old Man River."
The river had become so shallow that on this day Kane's party had to unload the boat twice. Thursday, October 29, 1846. The riverbank was very high but Kane climbed it and saw the Rocky Mountains for the first time, although smoke from forest fires, common in the fall, partly obscured their outline. McGilvray went hunting and wounded a moose. Taking to the water, Kane followed it with a boat and stopped it with his first shot. They made camp at the spot and enjoyed the fine large buck for supper. Friday, October 30, 1846. The group proceeded upriver carrying the remains from the successful hunt and their supper the night before. Later in the day the men gave a hearty cheer when they glimpsed their first view of the mountains from the boat. Saturday, October 31, 1846. The day was clear but very cold and Kane made a sketch of the river with the mountains in the distance. For a considerable distance down the river the mountains provide a backdrop to the upstream view. Sunday, November 1, 1846.
We entered Jasper's Lake in the morning. This lake is about 12 miles long, and from 3 to 4 miles wide, but at this season of the year very shallow, on account of its sources in the mountains being frozen.
As there was not enough water, they had to take 3 men to the south shore, but even with the lighter load they found progress difficult. No sooner had the men gone ashore than a heavy wind and snowstorm hit. They found themselves being driven across to the north shore where they made camp. Unfortunately, there was no way to communicate with the men left on the other side of the lake. They feared the 3 would be suffering badly because they had neither food nor blankets, and with the storm the temperature had become very cold. Kane's Jasper Lake is Bruhl Lake, located at the east gate of Jasper National Park. Bruhl in French means burnt, and the lake was probably named by early voyagers after the stands of burned timber along its shores. Bruhl Lake is continually swept by sand-carrying winds which often reach gale force. The lake is shallow and there are many sand bars at the upper end. Because the lake is large, it is very sensitive to the wind and conditions can change from placid to stormy very quickly. Monday, November 2, 1846.
We were now close upon the mountains, and it is scarcely possible to conceive the intense force with which the wind howled through a gap formed by a perpendicular rock called Metz Rock, 1,500 feet high, on the one side, and a lofty mountain on the other. The former derives its appellation from a French voyageur, who climbed its summit and sat smoking his pipe with his legs hanging over the fearful abyss.
Finding progress by boat impossible because of the wind and the shallow water, McGillivray and a guide went on to Jasper House, which was about 23 kilometers away, to obtain horses. Rochemiette is as much a landmark to visitors entering Jasper National Park today as it was to earlier explorers who invariably described it in their journals. James Hector, following the valley in January 31, 1859, recorded that,
"We got a splendid view of the mountains, which present a bolder outline here than I have seen elsewhere. Metz Rock is a bold object, bounding the valley of the Athabasca to the south."
Kane had heard the story told by voyagers describing how the mountain was named. In French-Canadian folklore, Miette had become a legendary figure who traveled throughout the Northwest. He was a great fiddler and spinner of yarns who enlivened every campfire. One who would do anything on a dare, Miette, according to the legend, was passing the great mountain on the Athabasca one day when one of his companions laughingly pointed to the summit and jokingly jibed, "You tell us next how one time you smoked a pipe on top." So Miette climbed it and sat there dangling his feet over the terrifying drop-off. Rejoining his friends he remarked casually, "Been haved a nice smoke up dear with St. Peter on the gate." The story may not be absolutely true, but a voyageur named Miette did live in the Athabasca Valley where he worked for the Hudson's Bay Company in the 1830s, hauling coal from the Rochemiette area to Jasper House. Tuesday, November 3, 1846. The wind and snow continued. Kane was not surprised because he had been told that the valley was always windy. He was surrounded by a thick forest of tall, thin pines which
waved in the wind like a field of grain. The immense long roots seemed to be especially provided them by nature to prevent their being blown over, and, as the soil is very light, and upon a rocky foundation, these roots formed a network near the surface, which was in constant motion, and rocked us to sleep as we lay round our campfires.
The guide returned from Jasper House with horses, and soon after, they found their boat blown out of water and lying about 4 meters up the shore. Because it was so heavy the remaining 9 men could not drag it back to the lake. Now that the guide had returned from Jasper House with horses, Kane set out with him ahead of the rest of the party. During the difficult ride of 4 hours, he forded the Athabasca River 4 times. The rapid current was crowded with drift ice which sometimes came over the saddle. Cold, wet and famished, Kane finally arrived at Jasper House where he was greeted by a blazing fire and 3 kilograms of mountain sheep which at the time seemed more delicious than any domestic sheep he had ever eaten. That evening there was great joy when the 3 men who had been left on the south shore came in. They had wandered through the woods for 3 days without food trying to find Jasper House, which none of them had seen before. At night they had huddled together to keep from freezing. One man had even failed to take his coat when he had been put ashore.
Another suffered dreadfully from the swelled state of his legs, caused by the strings usually tied round their leggings being too tight, and which owing to his benumbed condition, he did not perceive. We had some difficulty in cutting them off, as they were buried in the swollen flesh.
Kane traveled on horseback from Bruhl Lake, north of the Jasper Park East Gate, to the site of Jasper House on the west side of the Athabasca River, approximately opposite the Jasper House point of interest on Highway 16, about 16 kilometers from Jasper Park East Gate. Before the arrival of the railway and the use of dynamite, a spur from Rochemiette, known as Disaster Point, extended into the waters of the Athabasca River and demanded that travelers either struggle over the top or ford the stream. It was at this point Kane would have encountered ice floes at saddle height. No doubt, a number of disasters occurred as early visitors attempted to get around the barrier. Mountain sheep still populate the slopes of Disaster Point where they come to lick the mud, rich in the mineral calcium carbonate. Wednesday, November 4, 1846. While waiting for Mr. Lane and the rest of the party, whom he had left the day before and who arrived safely in the evening with the loaded horses, Kane had a chance to observe and sketch Jasper House.
Jasper's house consists of only 3 miserable log huts. The dwelling house is composed of 2 rooms, of about 14 or 15 feet square each. One of them is used by all comers and goers, Indians, voyagers, and traders, men, women, and children being huddled together indiscriminately, the other room being devoted to the exclusive occupation of Colin and his family, consisting of a Cree woman and 9 interesting Métis children. One of the other huts is used for storing provision in, when they can get any, and the other I should have thought a dog kennel had I seen many of the canine species about. This post is only kept up for the purposes of supplying horses to parties crossing the mountains.
Jasper House was one of the earliest outposts of the mountain for trade. It was originally established downstream at the northeast end of Bruhl Lake in 1813 by the Northwest Company after David Thompson's first journey over the Athabasca Pass in 1811. It received its name from one of the early post factors, Jasper House. In 1821 the Northwest Company was taken over by the Hudson's Bay Company and Jasper House was moved about 25 kilometers southwest from Bruhl Lake to the Athabasca River. It was primarily a supply station for fur brigades crossing the Rocky Mountains. Thursday, November 5, 1846. Before starting off for Athabasca Pass, Kane got an Indian to make him a pair of snowshoes, for they didn't expect to get the horses all the way across the mountains. Kane noted that there were no more than 20 Indians living around Jasper House and that they were shoe-swap from across the mountains. He sketched their chief who was called Capote Blanc by the voyagers. Kane related how a group of 37 had been traveling with their chief when they met a hostile tribe who invited them to sit down and smoke the pipe of peace. Unsuspectingly, the shoe-swap lay down their arms, but before they had time to smoke the peace pipe, their weapons were seized and all but 11 murdered. They fled to Jasper House where they remained. Returning to their own country would have meant crossing the lands of the hostile tribe. Kane left
this inhospitable spot about noon, and crossed the river in a small canoe to where men were waiting with horses, which they had swum across the river in the morning.
They continued up the Athabasca Valley, making their camp on a small prairie. Kane was moving southwest, following the Athabasca River and Highway 16 towards Jasper town site. The brigades setting out to cross the Athabasca Pass generally traveled on the east side of the Athabasca River. After crossing either over or around Disaster Point depending on the water level, they would have to cross Maligny River which, although difficult, was preferable to crossing the Miette. The terrain is also easier, as Mount Greenock of the De Smet Range on the west side of Jasper Lake comes to the shoreline. As the road approaches Jasper town site, Mount Edith Cavell dominates the background. During the days of the fur trade, the peak was known as La Montagne de la Grande Traverse, for it was a landmark to voyagers marking the opening to the Whirlpool Valley and the difficult trek ahead over the Athabasca Pass. During World War I it was renamed to commemorate an English nurse who was shot as a spy by the Germans. Friday, November 6, 1846. Kane's party only went a few kilometers and then camped at La Rose, that is, La Rocks, Prairie, for the next place to pasture horses was too far to reach that evening. Kane was probably traveling up the east side of the Athabasca River in order to avoid the Miette River, which is difficult to cross near its mouth. The Old Fur Trail passed behind Old Fort Point. Before heading up the Whirlpool River, the traditional camping spot, with good pasture, was Prairie de la Vache, that is, Cow or Buffalo Prairie, which is located in the general area of the start of the Wabasa Lake Trail, 15 kilometers south of the Jasper town site on the Icefields Parkway. When the explorer and fur trader David Thompson passed up the valley in January, in 1811, on his way to the Athabasca Pass, he abandoned his horses to winter on the grass here and noticed signs that buffalo had been feeding in the area. In 1824 Joseph Larocque, in charge of Jasper House, attempted to establish a permanent trading post in the Yellowhead Pass, now followed by Highway 16 through the Rockies west of Jasper. After failing to winter over, due to a shortage of food, a new depot was established along the bank of Cottonwood Creek just southeast of the railway underpass east of the Jasper town site. Soon abandoned, it would have been the building remains located closest to the prairie. This would explain Kane's reference to Prairie de la Vache as Larocque's Prairie. Paul Kane returned to the same spot, a year later, November 5, 1847. Saturday, November 7, 1846. Kane's party had a long day as they made their way over rugged rock and through tangled forest. As the elevation got higher, the snow became deeper and they began to feel the cold more. An Athabasca Trail exhibit is located at the confluence of the Whirlpool and Athabasca Rivers. Just upstream from this point the brigades would ford the Athabasca River and start the 48-kilometer ascent to the Athabasca Pass on the Continental Divide. The route continues as an old horse trail, staying close to the north bank of the Whirlpool River. Although several kilometers of trail have been brushed out between Scott Creek Flats and Cane Meadows, the last 8 km or so to the pass are poorly defined and usually quite boggy. Sunday, November 8, 1846. They saw 2 mountain goats looking down on them from a ledge of rock which appeared to be only a few centimeters wide. One of the Indians who had come with them from Jasper House to take back the horses once the depth of snow made their continuing impossible attempted to climb above the animal. To shoot a mountain goat from below was considered impossible because they always looked down. The goats spotted the hunter, however, and escaped by climbing even higher. Monday, November 9, 1846. The snow was becoming so deep that they realized they would be late getting across the mountains to boat encampment where a party was waiting with boats and provisions to allow Kane's group to continue on down the Columbia to Fort Vancouver. Boat Encampment was founded by David Thompson in 1811 and for about 50 years was the point where the pack trains that crossed the Athabasca Pass met the boats that traveled up and down the Columbia River. Kane felt that if the boats left, it would spell disaster, for there was no food supply that would permit a recrossing of the mountains. A guide and McGillivray were quickly sent ahead to assure those waiting that the party was on its way. Kane camped on the Grande Cote, large braided gravel flats, where they found snowshoes that had been hidden by a party who had left the mountains in the spring. The Grande Cote starts about 30 kilometers west of the trailhead at the Moab Lake parking lot. Tuesday, November 10, 1846. They had only traveled a short distance when the horses became stuck in the snow. They decided to camp so that those without horses would have time to make snowshoes, which had now become a necessity. The horses were sent back to Jasper House along with all excess baggage. Kane noted that some of the new hands who had been traveling since spring were now worn out and not much use. Wednesday, November 11, 1846. The experienced men were sent ahead to break a trail. Some beginners had trouble adjusting to snowshoes and the quality of their own creations seemed to make matters worse. Kane was very happy with the pair made for him at Jasper House and managed quite well. One of the experts was Mrs. Lane, who had brought her own pair from Red River where she had used them since childhood. Stopping early, they made for the first time a regular winter encampment. Such a camp, Kane related, was set up when the snow was so deep that it couldn't be removed to reach the ground. He went on to say that they could tell how deep snow got in an area by the height of tree stumps that were cut level with the snow cover at previous campfires. Some cuttings were 4 meters above them while tests showed there was snow 3 meters below.
Some of the old voyageurs amused themselves by telling the new hands or mangeurs du lard that the Indians in those parts were giants from 30 to 40 feet high, and that accounted for the trees being cut off at such an unusual height.
Kane described the procedure for setting up a winter camp. It is necessary to walk repeatedly with snowshoes over the place chosen for the encampment,
until it is sufficiently beaten down to bear a man without sinking on its surface. 5 or 6 logs of green timber, from 18 to 20 feet long, are laid down close together, in parallel lines, so as to form a platform. The fire of dry wood is then kindled on it, and pine branches are spread on each side, on which the party, wrapped in their blankets, lie down with their feet towards the fire. The parallel logs rarely burn through in one night, but the dropping coals and heat form a deep chasm immediately under the fire, into which the logs are prevented from falling by their length.
That night an Iroquois, who had placed himself too close to the fire, fell 2 meters into a chasm when the snow melted under him while he slept. His cries awoke the camp, who had a good laugh before dragging him out. Thursday, November 12, 1846. After climbing for 7 days, they reached the height of land where the waters divide.
There is a small lake at this eminence called the Committee's Punch Bowl. This forms the headwaters of one branch of the Columbia River on the west side of the mountains, and of the Athabasca on the east side. It is about 3/4 of a mile in circumference, and is remarkable as giving rise to two such mighty rivers, the waters of one emptying in the Pacific Ocean, and the other into the Arctic Sea.
They camped along the lake edge and had a very cold night. It was Sir George Simpson, the hard-driving governor of the Hudson's Bay Company, who gave the little pond at the Athabasca Pass the distinctive name, Committee Punch Bowl. On October 17, 1824 he entered the pass westbound on his way to the Pacific and was so impressed that such a little pond should be the start of two mighty rivers, that he named it after the powerful London board of the Hudson's Bay Company. Toasting the committee, after struggling up the pass carrying the traditional 41-kilogram pack, became one of the most colorful traditions of the fur trade. So well known was this ceremony that on early maps the size stretched as the legend grew, and often the little lake appeared to be about 16 kilometers in length. Details of the two-day trip from Highway 93A to the Committee Punch Bowl at Athabasca Pass are found following the entry of November 7, 1846. Friday, November 13, 1846. They walked across the frozen lake and started their descent of the west slope, known as the Grande Cote. The trail was so steep that in one day they went down to the same level as Jasper House on the east side. It was especially difficult wearing snowshoes and carrying packs. Their feet often slipped from under them and their loads rolled down the hill, with the result that the men soon began purposely pushing their packs ahead of them. When they reached the bottom of the big hill, they found the 8 men whom McGillivray and the guide had sent from boat encampment to assist them. Here they camped for the night. The west slope of the trail in British Columbia receives much more rain, and as a result, the trail has grown over. Travel is not recommended. On the west slope, the Committee Punch Bowl flows into Pacific Creek, which in turn flows into the Wood River with its 16 kilometers of braided channels along gravel flats, known to the voyagers as bat tours. Saturday, November 14, 1846. Kane remained at the campfire to finish a sketch while the others went on to boat encampment, where it was expected there would be a fresh supply of food. After completing his sketch, he started on his way alone and soon came to a river with a strong current.
Having followed their track in the snow to the edge of the river, and seeing the strength of the current, I began to look for other tracks, under the impression that they might possibly have discovered a way to get around it. But I was soon undeceived by seeing in the snow on the other side the path they had beaten down on the opposite bank. Nothing, therefore, remained but for me to take off my snowshoes and make the traverse. The water was up to my middle, running very rapidly, and filled with drift ice, some pieces of which struck me, and nearly forced me down the stream. I found on coming out of the water my capote and leggings frozen stiff. My difficulties, however, were only beginning, as I was obliged to cross again. For times, when, my legs becoming benumbed, I dared not venture on the 5th, until I had restored the circulation by running up and down the beach. I had to cross 12 others in a similar manner, being 17 in all, before I overtook the rest of the party at the encampment.
The difficulties encountered kept the group from getting as far as boat encampment. Although summer might seem a more desirable time to travel, it was only after the cold had set in that the water level was low enough to make river crossings practical. Sunday, November 15, 1846. They were reluctant to leave the warm fire of their camp but were soon plunging into one of the deepest crossings they had made. In order to withstand the power of the current with its floating ice, they would stand shoulder to shoulder in a line parallel with the stream so that each man supported those ahead of him. 2 of the more powerful men carried Mrs. Lane across the river. Kane found it annoying having to take off and put on his snowshoes over wet and frozen moccasins each time he crossed the river.
Before stopping to breakfast this morning, we crossed the river 25 times, and 12 times more before camping, having waded it 37 times in all during the day.
Exhausted from cold and hunger, Kane's party arrived at boat encampment about 5 p.m. and were treated to a blazing fire and boiling pork and corn soup which had been brought from Fort Vancouver. The men had been waiting for 39 days and were about to return to Fort Vancouver the next day had not the guide and McGillivray arrived. They had decided that Kane's party had either been cut off by Indians or else had found it impossible to cross the mountains. Kane was of the opinion that if their messengers had not arrived on time they would have perished, for their food supply would never have allowed them to recross the pass. Before setting off for the 1,931 kilometers trip down the Columbia to Fort Vancouver the next day, Kane described the scene.
The Columbia here makes long reaches, to and fro, through a valley, in some parts 3 miles wide, and backed with stupendous mountains, rearing their snowy tops above the clouds, and forming here and there immense glaciers, reflecting the rays of the sun with extreme brilliancy and prismatic beauty.
The lower reaches of the Wood River and the site of boat encampment are now flooded by the Mica Creek Dam, 134 kilometers north of Revelstoke, BC. Kane continued down the Columbia River, reaching Fort Vancouver in Oregon Territory on December 6, 1846, where he spent the winter sketching the region. At the end of March 1847, accompanied by 2 Indian guides, he left for Fort Victoria in a small wooden canoe. 40 kilometers out of Fort Vancouver, at the mouth of the Catalpaddle River, Kane sketched Mount St. Helens 64 kilometers away.
A stream of white smoke shot up from the crater of the mountain, and hovered a short time over its summit. It then settled down like a cap.
After returning to Fort Vancouver 3 months later, he started eastward on his homeward journey with the brigade on July 1, 1847. Stopping to sketch along the way, he arrived back at boat encampment on October 10, 1847. Expecting to meet with horses from the east with the furs for the annual payment to the Russians, Kane's party planned on returning with the horses over the Athabasca Pass to Jasper House, while the brigade from the east would take the boats and continue down the Columbia. Sunday, October 10 to Wednesday, October 27, 1847. Seeing smoke as he approached boat encampment, Kane thought the brigade had arrived, but instead found his old friend Capote Blanc from Jasper House and 2 Indians who had come over to hunt. They had been very successful and fed Kane's party large quantities of dried moose meat and beaver tails, for which they received a few small articles and ammunition. This time it was Kane's turn to sit and wait for the brigade coming over the mountains. The men spent the days gambling and trying to work charms that would hasten the arrival of the brigade. For instance, crosses were erected with one of the arms pointing to the direction from which the brigade was expected. Although there was very little game, the men did trap a few martens. The mountains were obscured with constant rain and snow, presenting only the occasional bright hours that could be used for sketching. By the 24th, Kane was getting anxious that, due to some disaster, the brigade might not arrive, and he attempted to get some of the men to accompany him across the mountains. They refused, and Kane had to stay and wait. Thursday, October 28, 1847. Happily, at about 3 p.m. a Hudson's Bay Company clerk arrived and announced that he had been sent ahead and that the brigade from the east would arrive the next day. Friday, October 29, 1847. The brigade arrived in the morning with between 50 and 60 horses loaded with provisions and with furs destined for Russia. It had taken 9 days to cross from Jasper House. Mr. Lowe, the man in charge, doubted the horses would be able to make it back, but Kane was anxious to leave. Saturday, October 30, 1847. The brigade from the east left to go down the Columbia in the boats that Kane's group had brought up the river. 4 Indians from the brigade remained behind to take the horses back and guide Kane across the mountains. Sunday, October 31, 1847. It was a beautiful morning, and at about 10 a.m. they started for the east side of the Athabasca Pass, loading 15 of the 56 horses. After trudging for about 20 kilometers from boat encampment along the bank of the Wood River, earlier known as the Portage River, they had to cross and recross the river as they traveled up 16 kilometers of braided gravel flats known American Samoa, the Grande Cote. The trail down the western slope of the pass on the British Columbia side of the Continental Divide is now overgrown. Boat encampment, the staging area for brigade trips down the Columbia, and much of the Wood River are flooded by the Mica Creek Dam, which is located 134 kilometers north of Revelstoke, BC. Travel is not recommended. Monday, November 1, 1847. Kane's party passed through the Pointe de Bois.
By about the worst road I had ever traveled, it being cut up by so many horses having passed it a short time previously. My horse stuck in a mud hole until it sank up to his head, and it was with the greatest difficulty that one of the men and myself extricated him alive. What with horses sticking in the mud, and packs falling off, the shouting to the animals in Cree and swearing at them in French, there being no oaths in the Indian languages, I never passed such a busy, tiresome, noisy, and disagreeable day in my life.
After getting through the heavily wooded area, there were more braided gravel flats, or batteurs, until they finally arrived at the bottom of the Grande Cote, where they camped. In fur trade history, there can be few trails that have required so much physical effort and endurance as the Athabasca Portage. There were, of course, numerous portages in all regions of Canada, and many were long and hard. But they had well-beaten trails and no drowning rivers to ford and ford again, and no Grande Cote. About the Athabasca Portage there was something dramatic, some epic quality that inspired those who traveled it to tell the saga of the trail. There are many fur trade journals that describe the most difficult section of the pass, the Grande Cote. The Big Hill was a formidable obstacle indeed. Tuesday, November 2, 1847. Starting an hour before daybreak to ascend the Grande Cote, the party found that the snow became deeper and deeper with every step. A horse with a heavy load fell down a slope, but neither upset his load nor hurt himself. They soon had him back on track.
The snow now reached up to the horse's sides as we slowly toiled along, and reached the summit just as the sun sank below the horizon, but we could not stop here, as there was no food for the horses. We were therefore obliged to push on past the committee's punch bowl, a lake I have before described.
It was very cold, and Kane's beard was a solid mass of ice. Long after dark they arrived at Encampment de Fusée, the first place the snow cover was light enough for the horses to forage. Kane was probably referring to Encampment du Fusil, a meadow on the upstream side of the stony wash which flows from the glacier on 3,050-meter, 10,000 feet, Mount Kane, today named after him. The campsite is located about 16 kilometers down the Whirlpool River from the summit of Athabasca Pass. Wednesday, November 3, 1847.
Last night was the coldest, according to my feelings, that I have ever experienced. I endeavored to thaw myself by melting some snow over the fire, but the water froze upon my hair and beard, although I stood as close as I well could to a blazing fire, and I actually had to scorch my face before I could thaw the ice out.
They passed the Grande Battue of the east slope, and finding less snow as they descended, they managed to reach the Encampment de Régalette by evening, and camp for the night. Kane was probably referring to Encampment d'Orignal, which is today considered the halfway camp to the top and is near the forks of the Middle Whirlpool and the Whirlpool Rivers. Thursday, November 4, 1847. As usual they started long before daylight. Early starts and late stops were common, for there was always the fear of being caught in a snowstorm with the horses. They tried to go as far as possible each day. About noon they came across an area where the whole forest had been uprooted by wind. Traveling was so difficult that for the first time hunger demanded they waste daylight time to eat.
After dinner we pushed on with renewed strength, but it was with great difficulty that we were enabled to get the horses through the fallen and tangled woods, and it was not until after nightfall that we reached the Grande Traverse, where we found 3 men, who had been sent out to meet us and assist in driving in our 60 horses, which were as yet all safe.
Mount Edith Cavell, on the north side of the lower Whirlpool, was, during the fur trade, known as La Montagne de la Grande Traverse, and marked the eastern entrance of the Great Crossing. Friday, November 5, 1847. In the morning, in the midst of a snowstorm, they arrived at the Athabasca River and discovered it in flood. Kane's party
proceeded to ford the rapid stream, although the snow was driving with such fury in our faces that we could not distinguish the opposite bank. The water almost covered the backs of the horses, and my pack, containing sketches and curiosities, and etc., had to be carried on the shoulders of the men riding across, to keep them out of the water.
After fording the river, they crossed La Rouge's Prairie, and camped at the same spot they had the year before on November 6, 1846. Kane was referring to Larocque's Prairie, more traditionally called Prairie de la Vache. In 1824 Joseph Larocque from Jasper House had established a fur trade depot on Cottonwood Creek southeast of the railway underpass east of Jasper town site. Although within a matter of months the decision was made to abandon the post, records show that the depot location continued to be used by passing brigades for 2 reasons. It was the head of navigation, the furthest upstream they could bring their canoes, and it was the dividing point where the routes over the 2 passes diverged and the brigades had to split, to follow either the Whirlpool over the Athabasca Pass or the Miette over the Yellowhead Pass. Adventurers wishing to follow the river can obtain a Parks Canada guidebook, The Athabasca River. The access point for followers of the fur trade route is Old Fort Point opposite Jasper town site and close to the site of Larocque's house. Saturday, November 6, 1847. As they continued on towards Jasper House the wind was extremely bitter. They passed along the edge of a frozen lake about 12 kilometers long as the snow billowed into their faces. It was so cold they could not ride the horses but walked behind them, using their bodies as protection against the wind.
My beard, the growth of nearly 2 years, gave me great trouble, as it became heavy with ice from the freezing of my breath. Even my nostrils became stopped up, and I was forced to breathe through my mouth.
Eventually, they came to an Indian lodge where they had the opportunity to thaw themselves out. Once they arrived at Jasper House, they soon forgot their past troubles over a meal of mountain sheep. Kane was traveling northeast along the Athabasca River. The lake Kane saw can be viewed from the Jasper Lake viewpoint 25.4 kilometers from the Jasper townsite east exit. November 7 to November 13, 1847. Kane did not report much about his activities at Jasper House but noted that the winter had been very cold and that a great number of bighorn sheep had come down to graze in the valley around the site. Each day the Indian hunters brought in a fresh supply of meat. Some of the men went out to make snowshoes for the return journey to Fort Edmonton. Birchwood was preferred and they had to travel 32 kilometers for it. Mountain sheep can be seen along the rugged slopes of Disaster Point about 12 kilometers from the Jasper Park East Gate. Sunday, November 14, 1847. The snowshoes, and a sledge for carrying passengers, packs, provisions and blankets were now completed. To pull the sledge, Kane obtained 2 dogs from the Indians and another he borrowed from Colin Fraser who was in charge of Jasper House. Accompanying him to Fort Edmonton were an Indian and a Métis who had come with Mr. Lowe and the brigade from Edmonton, and 7 others who were supposed to wait at Jasper House for Kane but had returned when the weather became very cold.
Had these 2 followed the example of their companions, I should have been obliged to spend a most dreary winter in the wretched accommodation which Jasper's house afforded.
The site of Jasper House is located on the far shore of the Athabasca River approximately opposite the Jasper House point of interest on Highway 16, about 16 kilometers from the Jasper Park East Gate. Monday, November 15, 1847. Early in the morning they put on their snowshoes and set off for Fort Edmonton. Kane reported that his snowshoes were the same as his own height, 1.8 meters. Because they had so few dogs and could not carry much in their sledge, they hoped their guns would provide more food on the way. About 25 kilometers from Jasper House they came to an Indian lodge inhabited by a woman and her 5 children. Her husband was out hunting. Described by Kane as a very kind woman, she invited them to stay the night. Since their legs were suffering from their first day on snowshoes, such an invitation saved them from having to make camp for themselves. When the hunter returned late in the evening with 4 sheep, including one on his back, they all set to work boiling and roasting one of them. By the end of the meal they had devoured a whole animal. The hunter had seen 34 animals that day and could not remember a winter when so many sheep had come down from the mountains.
He proved a most agreeable host, and entertained me with stories of his hunting exploits during the whole evening. My kind hostess prepared me a bed of sheep skins for the night, the most comfortable bed I had slept in for many months.
Kane camped in the general area of the Jasper Park East Gate. Tuesday, November 16, 1847. After eating breakfast and harnessing the dogs, they made their way through thick woods to Bruhl Lake. The wind, as before, was very strong.
Fortunately the wind always comes from the mountains. Had it been otherwise, we should not have been able to pass along the lake on the glare ice against such a storm of wind and sleet. As it was, we were blown along by the wind and could only stop ourselves by lying down, our sledge sometimes flying in front of the dogs, while we were enveloped in a cloud of snow that prevented our seeing more than a few yards before us.
When they were halfway across the lake they became aware of 2 Indians struggling towards them across the ice. On meeting, they all sat down for a smoke. Kane related that when Indians came to ice or frozen snow and had to take off their snowshoes, they also removed their moccasins and traveled barefoot. That way they preserved their moccasins. When they sat down they put them on dry and wrapped them in furs. The Indian method prevented a buildup of ice inside the moccasin, ice which cracked into slivers to cut the feet. After crossing the lake they traveled about 8 kilometers down the river and camped. Kane's Jasper Lake is not today's Jasper Lake. He is referring to Bruhl Lake, 15 kilometers downstream to the northeast, north of the Jasper Park East Gate. The intense wind of the area frequently caused problems. Shifting sand deposits on the east side of Bruhl Lake provided serious obstacles to engineers during the building of the Grand Trunk Railway when the line was pushed through in 1910. Reports state that railway cuts were filled in by the wind as fast as they were dug. Today, telegraph poles along the old alignment are buried to all but the topmost meter. Even on the west side of Bruhl Lake, where the Canadian National Railway has its tracks today, snow plows are needed during the summer to remove sand from the track alignment. The upper end of Bruhl Lake is plagued with sandbars, but these can be avoided by hugging the western shore. Like all large bodies of water, The lake is very sensitive to wind and can change from placid to rough very rapidly. To view the lake from the highway, proceed west from Hinton for 8 kilometers and turn north on Highway 40. At entrance, 4 kilometers down the road, turn west towards Bruhl, 12 kilometers away. From Bruhl Lake to Hinton, the Athabasca flows in a single channel between rolling foothills. There are numerous rapids and waves rise to 1 meter. Wednesday, November 17, 1847. The night was intensely cold, but everyone was in good spirits when they started in the morning. The joy was soon dampened by the problems they encountered. The rapid river had formed ice jams, some of which were almost impossible to climb over. In the hollows between the ice jams they had to feel their way with long sticks to be sure the ice was solid. This was necessary because there were often flat pieces of ice formed above the water level with no support beneath. These would give way and the traveler either fell into the raging water below or onto another layer of ice. Such traps were usually formed as ice jams along the rocky shore or at bends in the river. Once covered with snow, it was impossible to tell the good ice from the thin coat except by using a stick. They had not traveled very far when one of the men fell through a thin coat of ice. Fortunately, he was not submerged and they soon got him out. The dogs were now almost useless because they were unable to drag the sledge over the uneven surface end.
We were obliged to push the sledge after them with our poles, and often to lift the dogs, sledge, and baggage up and down the perpendicular ice ridges.
The party found it impossible to leave the river, for the forest was so dense. They feared they would starve to death before they made their way through it. Just before nightfall, Kane stepped through thin ice into swiftly moving water, but
happily, I neither lost my pole nor my presence of mind, so the men had time to come up and help me out, but the moment I was out of the water my clothes became perfectly stiff, and we were obliged to make a fire and encamp for the night.
Thursday, November 18, 1847. Kane felt that the situation was only getting worse as they went along. The best dog, belonging to Colin Fraser, gnawed through his cord and bolted back to Jasper House.
This was a serious loss, as besides his use in drawing the sledge, we did not know but that we might want to eat him, our provisions were getting so scarce.
Moreover, they had encountered very few rabbits, the only game available. Their next problem was the Grand Rapid, where they found an ice jam over 6 kilometers long and 4 meters high.
Over this continuous mass of icy pinnacles we scrambled with incredible labor, our limbs bruised with repeated falls, and our feet wounded and cut by treading on the sharp edges of fractured ice.
Finally, disheartened, exhausted and in pain, the party camped after traveling only about 18 kilometers. During the night they heard a tremendous roar created by the river rising amongst the mass of ice. As their camp was nearby, there was a moment of panic. They might be crushed, but they were too tired to consider a move and slept on. About 32 kilometers downstream from Hinton the choppy waters begin and continue for over 64 kilometers to where the Burland River joins the Athabasca River. The most difficult part is just downstream from Oldman Creek and is known today as Gooseneck Rapids, 64 kilometers from Hinton. The previous year, on seeing Oldman Creek while traveling up the Athabasca, Kane told a story about how the rapids were formed.
The Indians say that an evil spirit once came down this river, which is so rapid that no canoe can ascend it, and that having reached its mouth, where it enters the Athabasca, he made 5 steps down, leaving a rapid at every step. These rapids are a mile apart. After which he returned and went up his own river and has not since been heard of.
During periods of high water there are meter-high waves and exposed rocks. Along the river, wilderness camping sites may be found on islands or at creek mouths. The mouth of Oldman Creek is considered a good place to camp. Friday, November 19, 1847. Because of the water that had overflowed the ice during the night, they were obliged to travel through the woods. The fallen timber and brush were so thick, they had to cut a road for the dogs and sledge, taking 3 hours to go only 1.6 kilometers. After the
tangled and almost impossible growth of trees and underwood,
they were glad to get back to the ice jams. Kane was beginning to suffer from the ordeal.
My feet were so severely cut by the frozen strings of my snowshoes that I left a track of blood behind me on the snow at every step. At night when we encamped, it became so cold that we could only sleep for a few minutes at a time. No matter how large we made the fire, it would only keep that part warm which was immediately next to it, so that we were obliged to keep turning round and round to save ourselves from freezing.
Downstream from Oldman Creek, 64 kilometers from Hinton, the Athabasca River is characterized by numerous large waves or rollers. Many midstream islands dot the river and care should be taken at lower water levels to pick the right channel. Boaters are also reminded that the river water is not fit to drink. Saturday, November 20, 1847. Kane found that he had what the voyagers called mal de racket. The problem was common with those who walked too far when they were not accustomed to snowshoes.
It is felt at the instep. I do not know how to convey an idea of the intense pain, except by saying that it feels as if the bones were broken, and the rough edges were grinding against each other at every motion.
Sunday, November 21, 1847. The river dammed up a short distance from camp and threw ice up in mountainous heaps. Again they had to take to the woods, and by the time they reached the river, they were in a snowstorm which lasted all day. Despite Kane's mal de racket, they had to push on because the food was running out. Until this time they had fed the dogs each day, but food was now too precious and the dogs went without. Monday, November 22, 1847. It was still snowing, and as it got deeper, travel became more difficult. They stopped for the night after crossing Baptiste River. Today's Berland River is named after Baptiste Berland, an early trader. It appears as the Baptiste River on David Thompson's map of 1814. The name was changed to Berland in 1917 to avoid confusion with the Baptiste River, which flows into the North Saskatchewan River. Tuesday, November 23, 1847. The snow had stopped falling but lay so deep and feathery on the ground that snowshoeing became difficult. With each step the snowshoes sank and snow collected on top of them, adding greatly to the weight. Kane found that this increased the pain in his ankles after 2 or 3 hours walking. But as the sun was out, everyone was happy. They failed to find any rabbits, so they rationed their food and the dogs weren't fed. Wednesday, November 24, 1847. Kane's party again encountered open water and had to detour into the woods.
When we came to the river again, we found ourselves on the top of a high bank, down which we lowered our sledge and baggage, and then pitched the poor dogs after. As for ourselves, we scrambled at the commencement of the descent, then rolled a little by way of variety, and fell the rest of the way. However, the snow was so deep that we did not get hurt, and after some trouble in unburying ourselves at the bottom, we continued our route along the river.
Thursday, November 25, 1847. Kane had traveled about 32 kilometers when they came to a place on the river where
the current was so rapid that the ice was all tumbling about in broken masses.
High banks that were impossible to climb were on each side of the river. Kane mentioned that it was a rule when traveling
never to go back, and so their only choice was to camp at the bottom and hope the cold night would sufficiently freeze some of the masses of ice that they could cross in the morning. After our camp was made, the men, seeing me suffer so much from the mal de racket, recommended me to scarify, that is, make a series of small cuts in my insteps, and kindly offered to perform the operation, which is done with a sharp gunflint, but I was afraid of the frost getting into the wounds, and refused, although I had every confidence in their knowledge of what would be the best remedy in a case like mine.
They had not succeeded in shooting any animal since leaving Jasper House, and their food supply was almost gone.
Our poor dogs looked so savage and starved that we had to tie their heads close up to the trees, fearing lest they might gnaw the strings and make off.
Friday, November 26, 1847. Wearing their long snowshoes which distributed their weight over a large surface, they were able to proceed across the river with extreme caution. The dogs and sledge, however, went through the ice but were saved by an Indian who fastened a rope to the sledge and was able to pull them from the water. After getting across the ice jam, they found the ice on the river more stable than usual and traveled 65 kilometers before camping. Saturday, November 27, 1847. During the morning the party made good time, but Kane's ankles became so painful from the effort of lifting his snowshoes that he decided to walk without them. He had traveled only a short distance when he fell through the ice but managed to pull himself out.
Luckily, I got out easily enough, but I was wet through, and as our provisions were nearly all gone, and we were all hungry, I pushed on in my wet clothes, trusting to the violent exercise to keep me warm. I certainly did not suffer from the cold, but the freezing of my leathern trousers chafed my legs and made me very uncomfortable.
Camp was made after a very hard day, and because they hoped to reach Fort Assiniboine the next day, they ate the remaining food. Sunday, November 28, 1847. They started traveling at about 3 a.m., a half-hour earlier than usual because they had nothing to eat for breakfast. Kane felt his condition getting worse.
The Malder racket tortured me at every step. The soles of my feet were terribly cut and wounded from the ice, which formed inside of my stockings as much as 1/8 of an inch thick every day, occasioned by the freezing of the perspiration. It breaks in small pieces, and is like so much sharp gravel in the shoes, and I was weak from the want of food, but the hope of reaching a place of safety kept me up, and I toiled on over the Berdignio, which were very numerous today, steadily but slowly. At last, overcome with fatigue and weakness, we had to encamp still far from the fort.
The men had a meeting around the campfire to discuss whether or not they should eat the dogs. The thinness of the animals dissuaded them. Hunger and started their trek. It was decided that the day before, dogs together would not provide. Compared with other days, the wait was not difficult, although their weak condition caused them to travel slowly. At about 4 p.m. Kane arrived at Fort Assiniboine after traveling for 15 days from Jasper House. Immediately on their arrival they were presented with a feast of whitefish, which was usually the only source of food at the fort.
One of the women devoted herself to the rather arduous task of satisfying my appetite whilst my 2 men cooked on their own, thinking that nobody else would do it quick enough, and no cook who cared for his reputation would have dished up fish in the raw state which they devoured the first 2 or 3. I, however, controlled myself, and gave the woman a little time to prepare mine.
Kane wrapped his feet in clean pieces of blanket which were the traditional stockings used in the area and put on a pair of clean, dry moccasins. Picking up some raw fish, he went to feed the dogs.
It was almost miraculous to see the big lumps of fish which they gulped down, without even an attempt at mastication. Their appearance after the repast was singularly ridiculous, as their bellies were paunched out like full bladders, whilst the rest of their bodies retained still all the scraggy symptoms of prolonged hunger.
After feeding the dogs, Kane returned to the kitchen where the woman had wasted no time in getting his meal ready. He was seated on a pile of buffalo skins beside a fire where he
commenced the most luxurious repast of which it had ever been my fate to partake. I had no brandy, spirits, nor wine, neither had I tea, or coffee, nothing but water to drink. I had no Harvey's sauce, or ketchup, or butter, or bread, or potatoes, or any other vegetable. I had nothing but fish, no variety, save that some were broiled on the hot coals and some were boiled. But I had been suffering for days from intense cold, and I now had rest. I had been starving, and I now had food. I had been weary and in pain, without rest or relief, and I now had both rest and ease. But, to sum up all, I had come through a long and serious period, where for days I had been haunted with the idea that I must camp alone in that solitary forest, and let the men go on, with no food to support me but what I might obtain by the chance snaring of rabbits. It was, in fact, the dread of this almost hopeless alternative that urged me to exertions upon which I cannot look back except with wonder, and thus brought me at last to the safety and comfort in which I now luxuriated.
Kane had no idea how many fish his companions ate but noted that once full, they lay down to sleep only to wake up in the middle of the night to begin feasting again. Kane declined the offer to join them until about 5 a.m. when he
commenced again, and made another hearty meal, and then how happy I was when I lay down and slept again, instead of clambering over the rugged Berdignio. The river was behind them and there were no more ice jams to cross.
Kane was back at Fort Assiniboine, his first visit since he passed through more than a year ago on October 10, 1846. The building of the post in 1823 is referred to in the detailed journal kept by John Work, a clerk with the Hudson's Bay Company who made a trip that year from York Factory on Hudson Bay to the Pacific coast. On September 24, 1823, Work's journal reads,
About noon arrived at a new house which Mr. MacDonald, the gentleman who is superintending the building, calls Fort Assiniboine. It is situated on the north bank.
It was the northern point on the portage from Fort Edmonton to the Athabasca River en route to Fort Vancouver by way of the Athabasca Pass and boat encampment. Just 12 years later, in 1847 after Kane's visit, the post was in ruins. On January 16, 1859, when James Hector of the Palliser expedition arrived, the post was deserted.
Merely of a few ruinous log huts on the left bank built on a beautiful level prairie several miles in extent, and elevated 30 feet above the river.
The present-day village of Fort Assiniboine, 144 kilometers north-west of Edmonton, was incorporated in 1958. It has a population of 191. The original fort site is marked by a monument, and a representative log building houses a museum and senior citizens center. Tuesday, November 30th, and Wednesday, December 1st, 1847. In order to give his feet a chance to recover, Kane remained at Fort Assiniboine. He spent his time sleeping by the fire and eating fish, and by the evening of December 1st, the party felt so much better they decided to leave the next day for the 4-day trip to Fort Edmonton. Thursday, December 2nd, 1847. Taking only a few provisions because they were informed there were lots of rabbits on the way, the party set off for Fort Edmonton. Progress was slow because they had to scramble over fallen trees. Nevertheless, with renewed strength, and with the knowledge that there would be a good supper at the other end, their spirits remained high and they were able to make a very good day's journey. After setting up camp, they set to cooking the many rabbits they had killed on the route. Rabbits were abundant and ran through the camp the whole evening. The Indians fastened snares to the tops of young saplings which sprang up when the rabbits stepped into them. This kept the animal suspended and away from wolves and lynx who were continually hunting the rabbits. The method of catching lynx also intrigued Kane. The animal was caught in a noose attached to a small movable log which it dragged. But it made no effort to gnaw through the string, something Kane felt could have been done with no effort. Kane was returning along the same route he followed from October 6 to October 10, 1846, when he came from Fort Edmonton to Fort Assiniboine. The portage between the Athabasca and the North Saskatchewan rivers was originally an old Indian trail which had become the major route. 25 years earlier, Sir George Simpson, Governor-in-Chief of the Hudson's Bay Company, hired a freeman, Jacques Cardinal, to widen the trail, and with the construction of Fort Assiniboine in 1823, the portage became the major fur trade route to the Pacific. A freeman was a term applied to Hudson's Bay Company servants whose contracted service had expired. They had earned an honorable discharge and were now free to come and go as they pleased. The route generally runs parallel with Highway 33, as it goes southeast past Barrhead. After crossing the Pembina River, the trail passes the northern tip of Lac La Non, the fishery for Fort Assiniboine, 48 kilometers to the north. Continuing in a southeasterly direction, the trail goes between Nakaman and Dead Man Lakes. After crossing a ridge on the Alexander Indian Reserve, it parallels the Rivière Key Bar to St. Albert, ending below the Alberta Legislature building which was the site of Fort Edmonton. Friday, December 3rd and Saturday, December 4th, 1847. They continued through woods but with fine weather and lots of rabbits.
The journey seemed like a mere pleasure trip in comparison with what we had gone through.
Sunday, December 5th, 1847. In the evening they arrived at Fort Edmonton where they met a Mr. Harriot who had been appointed a chief trader of the Hudson's Bay Company in 1846. During his stay Kane was given his own room.
This was to be my headquarters for the winter, and certainly no place in the interior is at all equal to it, either in comfort or interest.
There were about 50 company servants employed at the fort and, with wives and children, the population numbered about 130. Kane noted there was an abundance of coal in the area, but since there were few grates or furnaces in the buildings, little of the coal was used except in the blacksmith's forge. Food was plentiful and consisted of fresh buffalo meat, venison, salted geese, white fish, rabbits, potatoes, turnips, and flour. Although wheat was grown, Kane was told it was often destroyed by an early frost. A windmill to grind corn into flour had been built since his last visit. Thousands of buffalo ranged close to the fort and rabbits scurried with wolves and lynx in strong pursuit. A number of different tribes came to Fort Edmonton to sell dried buffalo meat and fat which was made into pemmican and distributed to other posts. Buffalo were unusually numerous and the men had already begun gathering a fresh supply of meat which they kept over the summer in an ice pit. This was a square hole large enough to hold over 700 buffalo carcasses. Blocks were cut from river ice with saws and held together in the pit by pouring water between the blocks and allowing it to freeze. The head and feet of the buffalo were severed and the carcass quartered. When the pit was filled, it was protected with a thick covering of straw.
In this manner the meat keeps perfectly good through the whole summer, and eats much better than fresh killed meat, being more tender and better flavored.
Shortly after his arrival at Fort Edmonton, Kane, Mr. Harriot, and 2 other gentlemen went on a buffalo hunt. About a dozen horses were selected from a band of about 800 that were kept outside the fort to forage for themselves. The horsekeeper and his family followed the herd, turning them towards the fort if they tended to wander too far. The job was not difficult because the animals had learned they would only be safe from the wolves by staying together and remaining close to the settlement. After a hearty breakfast of whitefish and buffalo tongues, they left the fort and followed a track that men had made hauling wood along the frozen river. After about 20 kilometers they spotted a herd of buffalo on the riverbank, but a dog ran ahead and scared them off.
We caught the dog, and tied his legs together, and left him lying in the road to wait our return.
5 kilometers further they came to a large area where the snow was trodden down. Ascending the bank, they found themselves in the midst of a herd of about 10,000 buffalo.
An Indian hunter started off for the purpose of turning some of them towards us, but the snow was so deep that the buffaloes were either unable or unwilling to run far, and at last came to a dead stand. We therefore secured our horses, and advanced towards them on foot to within 40 or 50 yards, when we commenced firing, which we continued to do until we were tired of a sport so little exciting, for, strange to say, they never tried either to escape or to attack us.
Kane spotted a large bull which he decided to kill in order to get the skin and enormous head as a trophy. The animal fell, but 3 others surrounding it could not be frightened away. Afraid to venture near his prize, he finally had to shoot them all, despite the fact that bulls were not generally saved for meat. As there was little challenge in their sport, they decided to return and send men out for the carcasses. At the fort, the men were told to get the dog sledges and pick up the 27 cows that had been killed, as well as the trophy bull. The women of the fort had the job of catching the sledge dogs required. Like the horses, about 250 dogs foraged around the fort. As valuable as horses, 2 of them could easily pull a large cow.
Yet no care is taken of them, except that of beating them sufficiently before using them, to make them quiet for the time they are in harness.
Since the dogs were almost as wild as wolves, the only way they could be caught was by tricking them one at a time in the fall and tying light logs to them. The logs served as anchors which the dogs dragged around, and it made them easy to catch when required.
Early next morning I was roused by a yelling and scream, that made me rush from my room, thinking that we were all being murdered, and there I saw the women harnessing the dogs. Such a scene! The women were like so many furies with big sticks, threshing away at the poor animals, who rolled and yelled in agony and terror, until each team was yoked up and started off.
Men hunted and built York boats, which were more convenient to use on the Saskatchewan and Red Rivers than canoes. They were constantly being constructed, for less than half were required to return from York factory. The women made moccasins, men's clothing, packed the pemmican into 41-kilogram bags, and did all the household chores. The evenings were spent around a large fire smoking and gossiping. The French voyageurs had their fiddler and they sang, while the Indians, who were less emotional, looked on with solemn enjoyment. Only the gentlemen of the fort were allowed to have liquor, which they had to ship west at their own expense. Saturday, December 25, 1847. It was Christmas Day. The flag was raised and everyone dressed for the occasion.
Towards noon every chimney gave evidence of being in full blast, whilst savory steams of cooking pervaded the atmosphere in all directions.
About 2 o'clock Kane sat down for dinner with Mr. Harriot, 3 clerks, the Reverend Thibault, a visiting Roman Catholic missionary, and Reverend Rundle, the Protestant missionary who lived at the fort.
The dining hall in which we assembled was the largest room in the fort, probably about 50 by 25 feet, well warmed by large fires, which are scarcely ever allowed to go out. The walls and ceilings are boarded, as plastering is not used, there being no limestone within reach, but these boards are painted in a style of the most startling barbaric gaudiness, and the ceiling filled with centerpieces of fantastic gilt scrolls, making altogether a saloon which no white man would enter for the first time without a start, and which the Indians always looked upon with awe and wonder. The room was intended as a reception room for the wild chiefs who visited the fort, and the artist who designed the decorations was no doubt directed to astonish the natives. If such were his instructions, he deserves the highest praise for having faithfully complied with them, although, were he to attempt a repetition of the same style in one of the rooms of the Vatican, it might subject him to some severe criticisms.
After months of near starvation and only the most basic of foods at the best of times, Kane was most willing to indulge in a Christmas feast.
No tablecloth shed its snowy whiteness over the board, no silver candelabra or gaudy china interfered with its simple magnificence. The bright tin plates and dishes reflected jolly faces, and burnished gold can give no truer zest to a feast.
They dined on buffalo hump, dried moose nose, or mouthful, white fish browned in buffalo marrow, buffalo tongue, beaver tails, roast wild goose, heaps of potatoes, turnips, and bread, as well as boiled buffalo calf. The latter delicacy was taken from the cow by caesarean section before term.
Such was our jolly Christmas dinner at Edmonton, and long will it remain in my memory, although no pies, or puddings, or blancmanges shed their fragrance over the scene.
In the evening everybody at the fort was invited to a dance in the hall. They were in fine spirits and wearing their finest clothes.
Indians, whose chief ornament consisted in the paint on their faces, voyagers with bright sashes and neatly ornamented moccasins, maties glittering in every ornament they could lay their hands on.
Everyone was laughing and jabbering in as many different languages as there were styles of dress. A fiddler who played, with great vigor, had almost everybody dancing the night away. One of the ladies with whom Kane danced was Kunnewa Bum, or One That Looks at the Stars. He was so taken with her beauty that he asked if she would later allow him to paint her. This she did.
With great patience, holding her fan, which was made of the tip end of a swan's wing with an ornamental handle of porcupines, quills, in a most coquettish manner.
Thursday, January 6, 1848. Mr. John Rowan, Jr., son of the chief factor of the Saskatchewan district, and Margaret Harriet, daughter of the chief trader, James Harriet, were married at Fort Edmonton. Reverend Rundle performed the ceremony and there was feasting and dancing until midnight. Time was beginning to weigh heavily on his hands and Kane was happy to accept an offer to accompany the wedding party to their new home at Fort Pitt. Friday, January 7, 1848. Kane awoke to the sounds of preparation for the journey. By the time he entered the yard of the fort, he found the party of Mr. and Mrs. Rowand with 9 men and 46 dogs. There were 3 carrioles and 6 sledges,
forming when en route a long and picturesque cavalcade, all the dogs gaudily decorated with saddlecloths of various colors, fringed and embroidered in the most fantastic manner, with innumerable small bells and feathers, producing altogether a pleasing and enlivening effect.
The carrioles had been especially decorated for the occasion, with a special one built for the bride. It was elaborately painted and ornamented, and was drawn by a special set of dogs that had been brought from Lower Canada, that is Quebec, for the occasion by Mr. Rowand. Kane noted that a carriole was designed for carrying 1 person. A thin flat board about 46 centimeter wide was curved up at the front and had a straight back to lean against. The sides were
made of green buffalo hide, with the hair scraped completely off and dried, resembling thick parchment. This entirely covers the front part, so that a person slips into it as into a tin bath.
As evening approached, they arrived at an enclosure that had been constructed by Blackfoot, who occasionally came into the area to steal horses from the Cree. Tuesday, January 11, 1848. They met 2 Hudson's Bay Company men coming from Fort Carlton. Kane's party only killed 1 buffalo and were obliged to sleep directly on the snow, because there were no pine trees and branches to make beds. Wednesday, January 12, 1848. Once again they decided to follow the river, and they set off in the morning. Later in the day there was a near tragedy.
A herd of buffaloes had come down the bank onto the ice, and did not perceive our approach until the foremost sledge was so near them as to excite the dogs, who rushed furiously after them, notwithstanding all the efforts of the men to stop them. The spirit of the hunt was at once communicate through the whole line, and we were soon all, carrioles and sledges, dashing along at a furious rate after the buffaloes. The frightened animals made a bold dash at last through a deep snow bank, and attempted to scramble up the steep bank of the river, the top of which the foremost one had nearly reached, when, slipping, he rolled over and knocked those behind, one on top of another, down into the deep snowdrift amongst the men and dogs, who were struggling in it. It would be impossible to describe the wild scene of uproar and confusion that followed. Some of our sledges were smashed, and one of the men was nearly killed, but at last we succeeded in getting clear and repairing damages. We continued on our wedding tour.
Thursday, January 13, 1848. The group started at 1:30 a.m. and, following a buffalo track along the river, had trouble in the deep ruts, their carrioles frequently upset and rolled the occupants into the snow. 3 buffalo were killed along the riverbank, and when the stop was made for breakfast, the 2 remaining calves watched from a distance. Leaving the river, the convoy passed over a number of hills and valleys and after dark arrived at a Cree camp of about 40 lodges. They were invited into the lodge of Broken Arm where the chief spread
buffalo robes in the best part of his tent for us to sit on, and placing before us the best his stock afforded. After supper, the chief, having cut some tobacco and filled a handsome stone pipe, took a few whiffs from it himself, and then presented it to me. On my doing the same, and offering it to him again, as is the custom, he told me that he wished me to accept it as a gift. The lodge was soon filled with Indians, anxious to learn the news, which they are always eager to hear from strangers. Amongst our visitors was the son-in-law of the chief, and, according to the Indian custom, he took his seat with his back towards his father and mother-in-law, never addressing them but through a medium of a third party, and they preserving the same etiquette towards him. This rule is not broken until the son-in-law proves himself worthy of personally speaking to him. By having killed an enemy with white hairs, they then become entitled to wear a dress trimmed with human hair, taken from the scalps of their foes. I remarked that one of the leggings of the young man was spotted with some red earth, and the other not. On inquiring the reason, I was told that the spotted leg had been wounded, and the red earth was intended to indicate blood.
They stayed up very late talking to the chief. Among the topics was religion. The chief did not think Christianity would attract many Indians because each missionary believed that his own religion was the only correct one. The chief had concluded that he would wait until the missionaries had a council and agreed amongst themselves. Friday, January 14, 1848. After traveling the day through hilly country, they arrived at another camp of about 30 lodges where they were immediately attacked by all the Indian dogs in the camp. There was barking, howling, and fighting, and every sledge upset. Some were in pieces. It took half an hour to untangle 200 dogs. A short distance from the camp the Indians had a buffalo pound, which was literally crammed with the dead frozen carcasses they had slaughtered in it. Soon after dark they arrived at Fort Pitt. It had been a 7-day trip from Fort Edmonton. They had killed 17 buffalo on the way to feed themselves and their dogs, and for the whole distance they had never been out of sight of large herds of them which they were told had never been so numerous in the area. Around Fort Pitt many horses had been killed recently and many others severely gored by the horns of buffalo. The buffalo would watch the horses digging at the snow with their hoofs, and when they had located patches of grass, the buffalo would chase the horses away and take the grass for themselves. Saturday, January 15 to Friday, February 4, 1848. Kane stayed 20 days at Fort Pitt studying the Cree. Much of their culture revolved around the medicine pipe stem, and Kane was honored by being allowed to sketch it. A new person was elected every 4 years for the privilege of carrying the medicine pipe stem. Anyone who could afford the cost of 15 or 20 horses was eligible for the position. The man chosen resided in a highly ornamental skin tent, and the pipe stem was always wrapped and kept out of sight, except at rare times when the carrier would place it on a bear skin for special occasions such as the holding of a council of war or the medicine pipe stem dance. When a quarrel broke out within the tribe, the medicine man would open it for the two parties to smoke from, but for no reason would it be uncovered with a woman present. When the camp moved, the pipe stem was usually held by the carrier's favorite wife, and if it ever fell to the ground, it was regarded as a bad omen with many ceremonies necessary to reinstate it. The pipe stem carrier always sat at the right side of his lodge, and it was considered a mark of great disrespect to cross between him and the fire at the center of the lodge. Traditionally he would never cut his own meat. This was always done by one of his 5 or 6 wives and then placed in his medicine bowl, which he always carried with him, sometimes in his hand, other times on his head. One of the drawbacks to the office was that the pipe stem carrier was never allowed to scratch his own head. As a result, he carried a special stick for this purpose, because head lice were prevalent. In camp the carefully wrapped pipe stem was always left hanging, night and day, in a large bag outside the special lodge. 2 weeks after his arrival at Fort Pitt, Kane again met Kieekikaasekouwe, the man who gives the war whoop, who he had met on the way west in 1846. This time he was accompanied by his sub-chief, Mucky Powder. Kieekikaasekouwe was head chief of the Cree and was visiting all the camps trying to gain support for a war against the Blackfoot the following spring. He had collected 11 medicine pipe stems, 10 of which were from minor chiefs who had consented to join the expedition. Kane desired to see the ceremony connected with the opening of the pipe stems and traveled with him to a camp a few kilometers from Fort Pitt.
On our arrival, the wrappers of the stems were removed and carried in procession, headed by the chief in person, through the camp. The procession halted in front of nearly every lodge, where he delivered a continuous harangue, the burden of which was to rouse them to take up arms and revenge the death of the warriors who had been killed in former wars. During the whole of this address the tears continued to stream down his face as if at his entire command. This the Indians called crying for war.
The man was almost naked but was so able to concentrate that he was not bothered by -37°C weather. The next day Kane made an effort to get the chief to open the pipe stems so that he might sketch them, but this request was denied until it was mentioned that the artist was also a great medicine man and that
sketching them would very much increase their efficiency when opened on the field of battle.
With elaborate ceremony the pipe stem was unwrapped, with more ritual accompanying the actual smoking of the pipe. At one point the rite was suspended when a woman accidentally looked into the lodge. After each pipe had been brought out and smoked with suitable ceremony, Kane was allowed to make a sketch before the object was again wrapped. The chief said he intended to visit each camp on his war mission and that before he was finished he would have traveled over 1,000 kilometers. After 20 days at Fort Pitt sketching and listening to the stories of the Cree, Kane returned by the same route to Fort Edmonton. There he remained until he heard that a large band of Blackfoot were soon expected to arrive at Rocky Mountain House about 290 kilometers to the southwest. Wednesday, April 12 to Friday, April 21, 1848. On April 12, Kane left Edmonton for Rocky Mountain House in order to meet the Blackfoot who were on their way there to trade. Kane started with a small party of 6 men and about 20 horses, 10 of which were loaded with goods. Most of the horses were in poor shape, having foraged for themselves in the cold and snow all winter. The only one that had lived the winter in the protection of the fort was Kane's horse, and it was, as Kane described,
the most vicious brute I ever met.
Because of the condition of the horses, the trip was very slow, and when they reached Battle River they stopped to rest the animals for 2 days. Kane went hunting with an Indian and killed a buffalo cow but left the calf, for it would be easier to let the calf follow the carcass of the mother back to camp.
I pursued and caught it, and, tying my sash round its neck, endeavored to drag it along, but it plunged and tried so violently to escape that I was about to kill it, when the Indian took hold of its head, and turning up its muzzle, spat 2 or 3 times into it, when, much to my astonishment, the animal became perfectly docile, and followed us quietly to the camp, where it was immediately cooked for supper.
The first 3 rivers they came to were in flood and they crossed them by making rafts. At the 4th river Kane and the men discovered a large block of floating ice which they used as a craft to get all their goods across. Kane gives little information as to his route from Fort Edmonton to Rocky Mountain House, but his distance of 290 kilometers is very close to the trail known as the Blackfoot Track followed by James Hector in October 1859, and later marked on the map of the Palliser expedition. Starting on the south side of the North Saskatchewan River, opposite Fort Edmonton, which is below the site of today's Alberta Legislature, the trail crossed the southeast end of what is now the University of Alberta campus and followed the west side of White Mud Creek in a southwesterly direction. The creek was named after the white calcareous deposits along its banks which were used by the Hudson's Bay Company to whitewash buildings. It passed close to Phelan on Highway 13, between Pigeon Lake and Bear Hills Lake, and crossed Battle River close to its junction with Pigeon Lake Creek, 13 kilometers west of Usona, 29 kilometers northwest of Ponoka. Continuing in a southwesterly direction, the trail passed what James Hector called Prince Lake but which is referred to locally today as Mud Lake on the north side of Highway 53, about 24 kilometers west of Ponoka. The trail went around the northern tip of Gull Lake and touched the southern tip of Gabriel's Lake about 8 kilometers northeast of Withrow. Today's traveler, following the first grid road south of Gabriel's Lake in a westerly direction for 11 kilometers, will come to the top of a hill close to where early travelers had their first view of the Rockies. The creek below, named Last Hill Creek, referred to the last hill before Rocky Mountain House. Friday, April 21, 1848. Kane arrived at Rocky Mountain House, which he described as
beautifully situated on the banks of the Saskatchewan, in a small prairie, backed by the Rocky Mountains in the distance. It was built for the purpose of keeping a supply of goods to trade with the Blackfoot Indians, who come there every winter, and is abandoned and left empty every summer. It is built like most other forts, of wood, but with more than ordinary regard to strength.
The man in charge of the fort was a Cree Métis named James Jimmy Jock Bird. Jimmy Jock, somewhat a celebrity among the Blackfoot, had been sent west by the Hudson's Bay Company to learn their language and customs in order to entice them to trade. He married the daughter of one of the chiefs, left the company and lived with the Indians, eventually becoming a chief and a man of great influence within the tribe. Although missionaries had little respect for Jimmy Jock, Kane found him very hospitable and trustworthy and learned much from him about the Blackfoot way of life.
Shortly after my arrival, a report was brought in that the Blackfoot Indians had killed a party of Crees, and that amongst the slain was a pipe-stem carrier, whom they had skinned and stuffed with grass. The figure was then placed in a trail which the Crees were accustomed to pass on their hunting excursions.
Near the fort there was a camp of Assiniboine who lived in lodges, made entirely of pine branches. Kane found them most kind and honorable, and was allowed to sketch their head chief, Mamin, the Feather. Afterwards, as a token of friendship, the chief presented Kane with a collar of grizzly bear claws which he had worn for 24 years.
The second chief, Warhi-Jotasinin, the half-white man, seeing that I was so successful with his head chief's likeness, and probably a little jealous, came and requested me to take his also, which I willingly did, as he had one of the most extraordinary countenances I had met for some time.
The second chief had been a great hunter. Kane related that on one hunt Warhi-Jotasinin had been pursuing 2 moose when they separated. He followed one, killed it, cut it up and placed it on a scaffold to keep it from the wolves, and then returned to where the tracks had separated. He tracked down the second animal and secured it the same way before returning to his lodge late that evening. The next morning 3 men with dog sledges were sent to bring the game back to camp. It took them 3 days. Kane had nothing to eat at Rocky Mountain House but rabbits, and even these were not always available. Once the meat was dried, it was placed in a storage place for safekeeping. Occasionally, the Assiniboine, tempted by hunger, would help themselves to the cache but would always put
furs of considerable value in the place of the meat they had stolen. This was the second year they had played the same game, but however satisfactory the arrangement was to the Hudson's Bay Company, it certainly was anything but pleasant either to their servants or myself.
After having very little food for 10 days, and with no signs that the Blackfoot were going to arrive, Kane persuaded Jimmy Jock Bird to go back with him to Fort Edmonton. Bird told Kane that he had a cache of dried meat along the way that would be more than enough for them if they wasted no time getting to it. Early May, 1848. They departed with 4 extra horses to use as relays. 1 man rode in front and the second drove the loose horses on from behind. Kane related that they seldom strayed and that because they carried no weight were fairly fresh when required.
We rode the whole day at a tremendous pace, stimulated by hunger, and arrived at the cache towards dusk. Having tied our horses, Jemmy went to the cache, which was made of logs built together, something like a log house, but not very closely fitted together, and began throwing off the heavy logs which covered the top and concealed it. He heard a regular rumpus within, so he called to me to fetch the guns. When I got up, he removed part of the top, and a fine fat wolverine jumped out, which I immediately shot down. The brute must have been starved and desperately thin to have squeezed himself through the openings between the logs, and no doubt impelled by hunger, and the smell of the meat inside, had not thought much of a slight squeeze. However, when he was once in, and had had a good meal, he could not get out again, and the idea of starving himself as long as the meat lasted, did not seem to have occurred to him. This was a great disappointment to us, as there was very little left, and that, mangled, torn, and tossed about in the dirt of the animal.
They retrieved what meat they could for supper and saved a little for the coming days. The next day they pushed on through a heavy snowstorm and arrived at Fort Edmonton on the afternoon of the 3rd day. They had only 2 horses because the others, tired out, had been left behind. They likely followed the Blackfoot Track to Fort Edmonton. To trace the approximate route, leave the community of Rocky Mountain House by Highway 598 and go to Leslieville 24 kilometers east. At Leslieville turn north and then east at the first grid road. Within 6 km a relatively steep hill begins. Stop for a few moments to observe a last view of the Rockies. The creek below to the south is Last Hill Creek. It was the last hill before Rocky Mountain House. The track touched the southern shore of Gabriel's Lake 8 kilometers north of Withrow and then cut over to the northern tip of Gull Lake 13 kilometers east of Rimbey. Continuing in a northeast direction, the route passed what explorer James Hector called Prince Lake, Mud Lake, on the north side of Highway 53, about 24 kilometers west of Ponoka. The Blackfoot Track appears to have crossed Battle River close to its junction with Pigeon Lake Creek, 13 kilometers west of Usona, 29 km northwest of Ponoka. And further on it came close to Phelan on Highway 13 between Pigeon Lake and Bear Hills Lake. Continuing in the northeast direction, they came to WHI, to Mud Creek and Fort Edmonton. Monday, May 22, 1848. The brigade had arrived from the Rockies, and boats and cargoes at Fort Edmonton were waiting for a break in the weather to begin the journey down the North Saskatchewan River. Paul Kane would soon be on his way home. In 1846, Lieutenant Vavasour of the British Army visited Fort Edmonton and while there, drew a plan which was used to reconstruct the fort, now a part of Fort Edmonton Park. As part of the interpretive program at the park, York boats have been constructed using traditional techniques. During the summer season, York boat demonstrations are carried out along the North Saskatchewan River. Thursday, May 25, 1848. The weather had cleared up and the brigade set off with 23 boats and 130 men for Norway House down the North Saskatchewan River under the leadership of a Mr. Harriet.
We saw great numbers of dead buffaloes along the shore of the river, which, from the long continuous of the snow covering the herbage, had become so exhausted that they were drowned in attempting to swim across the river, in their accustomed migration to the south every spring, and now lay in thousands along the banks.
That night the York boats were tied together and under the guidance of one man the boats drifted with the current while everyone slept. The North Saskatchewan River from Edmonton to Fort Pitt along the Alberta-Saskatchewan border, a distance of 320 kilometers, has clear channels with only minor obstructions, such as the odd bridge support and shifting gravel bars in muddy water. The scenery has changed little from the days of the fur trade, although the herds of buffalo and other big game are gone. As inland trading posts and settlements grew, there was more demand for bulky machinery and fittings that could not be carried safely in canoes. Company technicians devised long, narrow, heavily built wooden craft which, because they were first built at York Factory on Hudson Bay, became known as York boats. They varied in length and width depending on where they were to be used, but 12 meters by 3 meters amidship was a common size. They had heavy keels, stout posts at stem and stern, close ribs, thick planking and flat bottoms so that they could be rolled on logs across rough portages with part of their load in place. The boats were pointed at both ends and the sides sloped inwards. A heavy wooden rudder was often hung at the stern or rear of the craft, while at other times a large oar was used. The crews varied from 8 to 15 depending on the size of the craft and the portages. The boats were rowed with cumbersome oars called sweeps, sometimes 4 meters long. The crew stood up among the freight to row, each with his own sweep which pivoted on wooden pegs set into the side of the boat. Friday, May 26, 1848. In their York boats the travelers saw several large herds of buffalo swimming towards the south across the river. Saturday, May 27, 1848. With a strong current, the men pulling all day and drifting at night, they arrived at Fort Pitt. Sunday, May 28, 1848. The party remained at Fort Pitt while 2 boats loaded with furs and pemmican were being readied. The furs were going to York Factory on Hudson Bay to be shipped to Europe, while the pemmican was to be sent to posts where provisions were difficult to obtain. Kane took advantage of the delay to sketch a Cree chief who posed in full costume with a pipe stem in hand. This was Kane's 3rd visit to Fort Pitt. Monday, May 29, 1848.
We left Fort Pitt, quite filling the river with our fleet of boats, presenting a most imposing and animated appearance, considering that we were navigating inland waters so far from the boundaries of civilization.
The crew saw large numbers of wolves eating the carcasses of drowned buffalo and some of the men took sport in shooting the wolves as they swam across the river. Tuesday, May 30th and Wednesday, May 31st, 1848. They continued their course downriver.
In great humor and comfort, without meeting with anything which I considered particularly worthy of recording at the time, until
Thursday, June 1st, 1848. They spotted a large party of mounted Indians riding furiously towards them. As they came closer they were identified as Blackfoot, Blood, Sarcee, Gros Ventre, and Piegan Indians. There was a Cree in one of the boats and he was quickly hidden under skins, for the approaching Indians were on their way to attack the Cree. After leaving orders with the men to keep the boats afloat but near the shore so that an escape would be possible, Kane and Harriet stepped out to meet the Indians on the riverbank. A number of Indians recognized Mr. Harriet and the greeting was friendly.
They immediately spread a buffalo skin for us to sit down upon, depositing all their arms, consisting of knives, guns, and bows and arrows, on the ground in front of us, in token of amity.
One Indian chief who Kane had heard of before, Omox Isisiksani, Big Snake, refused to join the others but rather
walked round the party, cracking and flourishing a whip, and singing a war song, evidently desirous of getting up a fight, and refusing to lay down his arms with the rest, although frequently requested to do so.
Eventually he sat with the group, and after reluctantly taking a few puffs from the pipe that was being passed around, he offered his horse to Mr. Harriot, who refused because it would be impossible to take in a boat. 1,500 warriors and 1,200 lodges were moving towards Edmonton in pursuit of Cree and Assiniboine. Kane related that
they were the best mounted, the best looking, the most warlike in appearance, and the best accoutred of any tribe I had ever seen on the continent during my route.
The Blackfoot expected to have a fight with the Cree the next day, so in the afternoon they performed a medicine dance. Kane was invited to attend in order to add his magical powers.
Amongst all the tribes here assembled, the sacredness of the medicine pipe stem is held in very high estimation, and it was with much solemnity that I was placed in the best position to work my incantations, that is to say, to make the sketch.
Friday, June 2, 1848. The brigade again set off after presenting the chiefs with tobacco, but within a few kilometers they stopped along the shore again. An old blood Indian chief, who had arrived just before the brigade embarked, was galloping along the shore after the boats. He had discovered that his old friend, Mr. Harriot, whom he had known many years before, was aboard, and he wished to talk with him again.
After the talk, he stripped himself naked, excepting his breechcloth. Mr. Harriot, not to be behindhand with him, gave him everything but his shirt and pantaloons. It was rather a losing operation for him, although the chief's leather shirt and leggings were quite new and highly ornamented, yet they were not exactly what Mr. Harriot would like to wear, so he gave them to me to add to my stock of Indian costumes. One of the Indians who had accompanied the old chief, noticing I had a new capote on, thought he would try what could be done by an interchange of civilities with me. He accordingly took off a dirty old greasy shirt he had on, and laid it down before me, but as I had no other clothes with me but what I had on, I was forced to decline this most enduring mark of friendship, much to his disappointment, although the scamp could not help grinning as I shook my head in token of refusal.
Saturday, June 3, 1848. The brigade did not travel because of a snowstorm. Sunday, June 4, 1848. Before noon they arrived at Fort Carlton. The Cree around the fort, on hearing there was a large party of Blackfoot in the area, set up a camp about 23 kilometers from the fort to oppose the attackers. Monday, June 5, 1848. The brigade remained at Fort Carlton all day. Mr. Harriot felt their presence might lessen the chance of a Blackfoot attack. Tuesday, June 6, 1848. News arrived that a battle between the Blackfoot and Cree had taken place. The Cree had a medicine dance and erected a pole on which they hung their medicine bags while dancing. Afterwards they returned to their camp of 90 lodges about 5 kilometers away and left the medicine pole standing. The invading party soon discovered the pole, and when one of them climbed to the top to tear off the ornaments, he spotted the Cree camp. The Blackfoot prepared for battle. A Cree scout had also spotted the Blackfoot but misjudged the numbers and immediately attacked. When the Cree discovered they were greatly outnumbered, they retreated to their camp.
The whole camp now fled with their women and children, leaving their lodges standing, except 2 old and enfeebled chiefs, who, as is not unusual amongst Indians under such circumstances, remained in the best lodge, and having dressed themselves in the gayest of clothes and ornaments, painted their faces, lit their pipes, and sat singing their war songs, until the Blackfeet came up and soon dispatched them. In the ensuing battle there were 19 Cree killed and 40 wounded. The Sassy lost 1 and, after taking 6 scalps, retired from battle to have a dance with the scalps. The Bloods, after losing 3, also retired after taking a few scalps. The Blackfoot, who had lost 6, continued the fight, while the Pagan and Grosvenor Indians did not arrive until the fighting was over. On hearing the news, Mr. Harriot ordered the brigade to resume the journey because he felt the ordeal was now over. Kane related that it was the custom of the Indians to return to one's own country once there was some success and a few scalps to take with them. It was expected the Blackfoot would be going home. The brigade had left buffalo territory and was almost out of fresh meat, although a little had been brought along for the use of the gentlemen of the party. The men, however, were plentifully supplied with pemmican. Thursday, the 8th of June 1848. The brigade continued down the Saskatchewan River. Saturday, the 10th of June 1848. The party arrived at Cumberland House. Monday, the 12th of June 1848. Arriving at the Pars, Kane met a French-Canadian man who was married to a Cree woman who was one of the most extraordinary-looking women I had ever seen. She was so fat that she was obliged to sit on a small wagon, in which they drew her about, and her mode of going to bed was by rolling off this onto a buffalo skin. She had not been able to use her legs for many years. Saturday, the 17th of June 1848. The brigade arrived at Grand Rapids and camped on Lake Winnipeg. After crossing the lake, the brigade continued on to York Factory on Hudson Bay while Kane remained at Norway House. There he waited a month to join a group returning to the east by way of Winnipeg River to Thunder Bay and Lake Superior. Before Kane left Norway House, some Cree arrived with news that one of their chiefs had killed the great Blackfoot chief, Big Snake. The information was incorrect, for Big Snake did not die until 1858. Monday, the 14th of August 1848.
After traveling south, down Lake Winnipeg, then up the Winnipeg River, along the Voyageurs for trade route, Kane reached Portage, now known as Ken or Ontario.
Wednesday, the 23rd of August 1848. Kane arrived at Fort Frances. Tuesday, the 19th of September 1848. The party reached Thunder Bay and the Great Lakes. Sunday, the 1st of October 1848.
Kane arrived at Sault Ste. Marie.
At this point Paul Kane considered his Indian travels complete. The rest of my journey home to Toronto was performed on board steamboats, and the greatest hardship I had to endure was the difficulty I found in trying to sleep in a civilized bed. November, 1848. When Kane reached Toronto in October, his plans were to immediately start painting canvases from the hundreds of sketches he had made.
His journey had been well discussed around Toronto,
and he was asked to put on a public display of his work. On the 8th of November 1848 the exhibition opened with 240 sketches.
The newspapers and the public were delighted and Eastern Canada had its first look at its own West.
Paul Kane, later years. In 1849, while Paul Kane was working on the last of the paintings that had been commissioned by Sir George Simpson, he was given the opportunity to make another Western trip. The invitation was accepted but, following a frustrating first stage, the original party broke up and Kane went only as far as Fort Garry.
The artist's goal was to create a series of 100 large canvases which would cover the many phases of Indian life and which would be preserved for the people of Canada. In 1851 8 canvases were exhibited at the Upper Canada Provincial Exhibition in Brockville, Ontario. Again, the display was well received, and it was suggested that the Canadian government purchase the set. Kane had already approached the government the year before, and in August 1851 it took action and requested 12 paintings. Kane now had an income and could continue work on his 100 canvases. These were bought by George William Allen, whom Kane had likely met at the original Toronto exhibit in 1848. Allen was a young lawyer and capitalist who had broad interests. He had studied art as a boy and his interest had continued. Over the years he had been president of the Ontario Society of Artists and involved with other cultural organizations, including the Toronto Conservatory of Music and the Historical Society of Ontario. He was a Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, a Canadian senator from 1867 and Speaker of the Senate from 1888 to 1891. In 1852 he had inherited a considerable fortune and bought the 100 paintings, now almost complete, as well as the Indian curiosities which Kane had put into storage. Paul Kane was 44 when he married Harriet Clench from Cobourg, Ontario. She was the daughter of a cabinet maker, for whom he had worked before he left for the United States in 1836. Herself an artist, she was sympathetic to his work. Much of the fine furniture given to the couple as a wedding present still graces the homes of their descendants. In 1855, part of the George Allen collection was borrowed by the Canadian government for an exhibition of Paul Kane's paintings at the World's Fair in Paris, where it received wide acclaim from both the public and the critics. The collection continued to hang in the Allen family's stately home in Toronto, where a large room, set aside as the museum, contained the Indian curiosities. But in 1901 financial difficulties, following George W. Allen's death, resulted in the sale of the paintings to Sir William Osler, who, in 1912, donated them to the Royal Ontario Museum. Paul Kane's dream was realized, for the paintings are now held as part of a public collection in Canada. The Allen family donated the other Kane artifacts to the Manitoba Museum of Man and Nature in Winnipeg. And what about Kane's book, Wanderings of an Artist Among the Indians of North America? When Kane returned from his historic trip west, he was both penniless and in want of recognition. A book, he felt, would bring in royalties and wider recognition than would his paintings. The artist George Catlin had already written a book, which had been reprinted several times, about his travels in the American West. Catlin's success encouraged Kane to go ahead with his own volume. Work on Kane's book proceeded simultaneously with his painting schedule and, by 1858, the difficulties of finding a publisher had been overcome and the book appeared the following year. It was an immediate success. The English edition was soon sold out and within 4 years 3 foreign-language editions appeared. Kane settled down to a quiet life in Toronto. A home was built at 56 Wellesley Street, which was graced with fine furniture and paintings by such artists as Leonardo da Vinci and Raphael. As two of Toronto's most respected citizens, he and his wife raised 2 sons and 2 daughters. Very few canvases other than those based on his Western sketches were done during the rest of his life. By 1859 Kane's major goals were achieved, the commissioned group of paintings was completed and his book was published. At the same time, his eyesight was beginning to fail and he lost interest in painting, promoting or exhibiting his work. In the 1860s he gave up his studio. With increasing blindness, which he attributed to some extent to the strong glare of the sun from his early Rocky Mountain explorations, he kept more and more to himself. Paul Kane died on February 20, 1871 at the age of 61. In the quiet of Midtown St. James Cemetery, Toronto, a stone was erected to commemorate one of Canada's most remarkable pioneer artists.